Good morning, everyone. Thank you for coming to this excellent session. This morning, I think we are opening this land and property research conference, annually led by Klaus, Thea, and the team. So thanks so much, Klaus, and everybody for organizing this conference. I think it always brings together some of the best research in land. So it's very exciting. This morning, we'll have a great panel of researchers who have been thinking about property rights, technology, and mortgage markets. We'll have Tom Wilkening from University of Melbourne open the panel, and then we'll proceed. So Tom, I think we said it's 20 minutes for each speaker, okay. Followed by 5 minutes of Q&A on each paper. But that will, since we have 2 hours, that will leave us quite a bit of time for Q&A at the end. So, I think the papers are really present a coherent research agenda, so it'll be good to have also questions at the end, kind of bringing it together. So please take notes and then come back to the speakers. Tom, the floor is yours.
All right, great. Well, thank you all for coming and for this great invitation to be here. This is a project which is kind of an extension of a research agenda that we have, which is thinking about using market design as a way of trying to improve some of the allocation efficiencies in land. This particular project is with John, who's over here, and Gary Briand. They're development economists. Dominic and Apollo were field teams and doing some of the spatial mapping things that we did, and I come from more of a market design aspect. Okay. So what is the problem that we're thinking about? Well, this is a problem that I think most of you are more familiar than I am on, which is thinking about reallocation of land in the context of East Africa. Okay? And so a simplistic version of this is that they still have very large families. Over time, they split their land across their kids. That leads to smaller and smaller pieces of land. They typically will want at some point to buy more land, and so they go and they search, but they're thin markets, and so they go and buy whatever they can, and so they end up with multiple pieces of land. And so we end up in a space where farmers have lots of pieces of land that are very small, that are very difficult to use mechanization on. Okay? And so kind of our question here is, are there going to be ways of us helping putting land back together? Is it something that farmers actually want to do? And are there ways to use market design as a set of tools that are going to allow us to try to improve the markets that exist? Okay? So a little bit of context. We're going to be working in the Kisoro district of Uganda. Most of the pieces of land here are very, very small. So an example here is this one, which is 600 square meters. The average square meters in our sample is going to be 0.16 square meter, or 0.16 hectares, which is 1,600 square meters. So they're very, very small pieces. You can't quite see it on the map on the right, but all the farmers here are going to have multiple pieces of land. So as an example, here are 2 farmers who have pieces of land that are adjacent to one another. There are other land holdings. You can see it's all over the village. They're walking multiple kilometers to be able to go across all their land. And so potentially there's going to be some level of gains of trade. Now, one of the things that I always ask when thinking about a problem like this is, why do I think it's hard? Why is it that the farmers themselves haven't been able to come up with ways of actually reallocating their land and doing so, if it's what they would want to do? Okay? And so our past research has been looking at that question, and we think there are kind of 4 reasons of why it's a difficult thing for us to trade land. Okay? So an example of this comes from just thinking about a contextual version of this, where we have a single farmer here, say farmer 16, who wants to put their land back together. Okay? We think there's kind of 4 issues that are going to arise in doing that. Right? The first one is that there's a fundamental, what we would call thin markets problem. Okay? So if we're thinking about this farmer trying to put their land together, it's not that they can go and buy from any single farmer out there, but it's actually just the ones around the land themselves. So instead of us having a market where everybody's able to trade with everybody, if consolidation is the thing that we're interested in, actually it's now only the farmers around them. So for instance, farmers 3, 10, and 9 that I can trade with. We know from a market design perspective that trying to trade when we only have a small number of buyers and sellers generates frictions. Okay? And so there's a large amount of results that think about markets where both people have private information, and then it turns out to be a very difficult thing for us to actually allocate and trade. Okay? The second problem exists when we're trying to move land, that it's going to require sequences of trades. So if I'm trying to move, for instance, my land holdings here to one where I have consolidated land, well, typically that's going to lead to sequences of actions. And those sequences of actions are going to actually lead us to situations where the farmers who are starting those sets of trades can put a disadvantage in future trades. So we talk about this as exposure problems. In exposure problems, it just means that once I start trading, in future trades, I'm at a disadvantage. That's painful to me. And so it might stop me from trading, or actually will reduce the speed at which trades occur. The third issue that exists is a sort of a transaction cost and complexity problem. When we're doing multiple transactions and each one have transaction costs, that just lifts up the cost of actually doing these things, which slows down trade. And if we want to get efficient allocations, we have to coordinate lots of different trades. That turns out to be a relatively difficult thing to do. Okay. And finally, if we're thinking of this in the development context, there's liquidity constraints. Right? It's likely the case that most of our farmers here are going to have a difficult time generating enough cash to be able to buy another piece of land. So the natural thing for me to do if I want to move would be first buy the thing near me, sell the thing that I want to sell later. That turns out to be a relatively difficult thing because everybody's going to be credit constrained. Again, that's going to slow down the market. Okay? So because of those four things, we're going to concentrate on particular types of transactions, which are going to be about coming up with combinatorial trades or conditional trades. So these are going to be actions such as, I'm willing to buy one piece of land if I can also sell another piece of land, and I'm willing to contribute a certain amount of money to be able to do that, or I require a certain amount of money to do that. Okay? So we're going to call these swaps, but essentially they're going to be transactions which have a monetary amount attached to it, where we're going to be trading packages of goods, sometimes buying goods, sometimes selling goods. Okay? We think those are going to help us in a number of ways. The first one is that it's going to thicken the markets that we're trading. So instead of me just now being constrained to, for instance, the packages that I have, I can now move around and look for different ways or have all sorts of conditional trades. Thicker markets we know are going to be efficiency enhancing. It's something that's going to help improve the markets. Okay. It's going to reduce these exposure risks because all the trades now are conditional. I don't end up having half of my transactions occur and get stuck with the other half. It's going to reduce transaction costs because now everything is going to be bundled. So essentially, instead of you having to do multiple transactions, I can concentrate on one. And finally, it's going to alleviate liquidity constraints because if we're thinking about it now, it's now only the residual difference in size of land that's the things we're actually going to have to trade. It's not the total amount of the valuations. So if I'm using one piece of my land to sell and buying another piece, essentially the differences in the transactions are only going to be the differences in the quality of the land and the size of those lands. Hopefully, that's going to improve the overall efficiency. So our original work has looked at a number of these, of trying to build combinatorial exchanges that help us to do these types of transactions. We think we have a pretty good system for being able to do this. And we have a number of kind of lab in the field projects where we've taken in farmers and have them actually do these types of trades. They seem to be able to use them in a very efficient way. And we have, I think, pretty good sense that this type of tools or these types of transactions are things that they are able to do and are actually excited to be able to do those types of trades. Now, that's great for having a system to do that, but there are kind of two problems that are going to float up that we don't have traction on them. This is kind of the research we're working on today. So the first one is there's a general complexity issue with using combinatorial exchanges. The left is what I've shown you before, which are relatively straightforward situations where you can kind of see how you should be able to do things. The right is what a real land problem looks like. Right? And if we're thinking about it, the difficulty here is that with combinatorial trades, packages explode in size as you're increasing the number of units that you're trading. Okay? And so somehow we have to get to a place where we're going to have farmers concentrating on the things that are the right things to trade, because as you expand those packages, things explode exponentially. The example I like to give is if I'm trading 10 pieces of things as a buy or a sell, I need 10 bids. If I'm using any package of size 10, you need 1,000,000 bids. So somehow we really need to concentrate them on particular types of trades. And so one of our first questions is what types of trades should we actually look at, and what type of information should we try to give farmers to try to improve those types of transactions? Okay. So our idea here is to kind of turn the market design problem on its head, and for us to pay attention to this idea that consolidation might have gains, which might be able to use to resolve other types of transactions. Okay, so our idea here is, well, if the gains to trade is about having consolidated land, then what we should look at is find farmers who have land that are next to each other, have another piece of land of similar size so that the amount of money being traded is relatively small, and then have the farmers concentrate on those types of trades. Okay, so that's kind of our main idea of what we're going to be doing here. We're going to basically flipping the problem, searching over the map of potential trades, finding pairs that we think are usable, offering those transactions, and then studying how many of those transactions have positive values for the farmers themselves, and then finding whether this is something that we think is going to be a scalable approach to trying to get people to concentrate on the right type of transactions. Okay. The second problem that floats up is everything we've done so far is assuming there's consolidation gains. Okay, so all our work so far has had this assumption that farmers do want to consolidate their land, that there's gains to trades. But in the literature itself, there are places that look like there might be diseconomies to scale, right? And we can see that in our own data. So in our own data, we ask people for lease prices, and we plot this in terms of average plot size per acre. You can see that diminishing returns. That exists in almost any literature you look into development. When you're under 10 acres in size, you get this diminishing returns in terms of lease prices and sometimes in terms of yields. Okay? So one thing is, what is generating that? Is it something that looks like it's actually diseconomies in scales, in which case we have an easier market design problem that people are going to be able to deal with? It also might say that we should focus only on assembly. Okay, so instead of us thinking about trying to consolidate small pieces, the only thing we should be trying to do is make big farms. That's a different type of approach. That turns out to be a much harder problem. It's also unpopular to farmers, so it may be something that's difficult to do, but nonetheless, that might be the only approach that we have. And so it's important to really understand the types of problems that we're going to be dealing with. Okay, so our kind of research questions are, first, we want a good estimate of the gains to consolidation. What does that look like? Is it positive on average? Is the distribution enough that we think trades are going to exist, that consolidation is important? How often can we find these swaps where there's positive returns to the swap? So how good are we going to be at targeting, just using observables? And finally, once we have a distribution of valuations, does it suggest the types of market design interventions that we should actually look at? Okay, so those are going to be our kind of research questions. So what are we going to talk about? I'm going to show results from a field experiment in Casaro. What we're going to do is measure demand for rental swaps. And we're going to do it in an incentive-compatible way, so I have very good estimates of people's actual willingness to pay to exchange their land with somebody else. Okay? We're going to estimate the value of those land consolidations, and then once we've done that, I'm going to take that information, I'm going to apply it to a number of different ways I can organize markets, and ask the question, how important, for instance, is it for us to get price information from farmers, or can we do it in a way that we're just, for instance, posting prices to them? Okay, so that's our goal. All right. So on the design side, what have we done? Well, we went to 5 villages in the Casaro district of Uganda. It's a place that doesn't have cadastral maps. So the first thing that we did is we actually created them. So we use satellite images in a way to basically find boundaries of farms. The way that's done is you take satellites over multiple times. Boundaries of farms, because they plant them at different times, show up on those satellite images, and you can get a first base pass of what the map actually looks like. Okay. After we've done that a number of times, we can get likely boundaries. We then go into the village. At the village, our field teams are going to go around. They go around with somebody who's in the village who identifies each piece of land. We verify what those pieces of land actually are. And then we basically manually correct all the lines based on the reports of those individuals. Okay. So once we've done that, we invite farmers as studies who have multiple pieces of land, who belong to the same village, and share a border with another farmer who also has multiple plots. Okay? So we invite that subset of individuals into our research program. About 70% of them agree to participate. Once we've done that, we've verified their land holdings, and then we identify and select a subset of potential trades between partners where they share adjacent plots. Okay? So our main thing is going to be looking for trades that look like this. We have 2 farmers who are next to each other, right? And each of them have another piece of land somewhere else that is close in size to those 2 pieces. Right? So that's going to be our main observation, is essentially these types of transactions. Okay. So for each one of these transactions, we're going to elicit 3 potential swaps. All right? So here's an example here where we have them at the bottom right. They have a piece of land A and 1 that are next to each other and adjacent. They also have 2 pieces of land that are farther away. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to ask the valuations for swapping plot 1 for plot B. Okay? That's going to consolidate the orange farmer, and it's going to leave the pink farmer with 2 pieces of land that are not consolidated somewhere else. Okay? We'll do the same thing for plot A and plot 2. So that will consolidate the pink farmer. It'll leave the orange farmer unconsolidated. And then we're going to ask for a swap of both those things in combination. All right? So we're going to swap plots A and B for slots 1 and 2. Okay. So why are we doing that? Well, if you take a problem, and you take those 3 things, right? There are 2 types of things floating around. One is there's going to be gains consolidation, right? And second, there's going to be transaction costs, right? So the first one of these, the one that consolidates the first farmer, right? Well, the valuation for that trade should be the differences in quality of land plus the consolidation gains minus the transaction cost, right? The second one is one that doesn't consolidate them, but includes the land D and A. So it gives me the difference in profits at valuations of those land minus the transaction costs. And then if I do both, I net out everything, and the thing that's remaining, if I take the first two and subtract out the third, is just that gains consolidation. Okay? So this approach is going to control for land quality, which I think is something that's an observable, but it's very difficult to deal with. Right? It's also going to deal with transaction costs, which is pretty good. And so we are ending up with a consolidation estimate that is actually very, very robust and very, very, very clear for us to be able to work at. Okay? So the advantage here is we're going to have control for heterogeneity and land quality. It'll control for additive transaction costs, for instance, things like potential for land disputes or seller degradation. It's going to underestimate sub-additive transaction costs, such as signing contracts and things like that. But the main issue that is going to float up in doing this is it's going to rely on three reports. And so there is a large issue, a potential issue in terms of measurement error. Right? We're going to solve that by giving them lots and lots of training, basically lots of examples of how to do this. We spend almost a day with every single farmer to try to get them to the point where they understand what they're doing, because that is kind of our concern here in terms of validity. Okay. All right, so what are we going to do in each of these trades? We want to get information about their true willingness to pay. And if you're going to do this, if you're asking people what they would be willing to do, obviously they're in a world where they would bargain with each other, and so typically they're going to lie a little bit in terms of what's going to happen. Okay? So the way that we do this is we're going or 1,500 individual trade observations. I would say that our data actually turns out to be pretty good. We had 69 of our trades that should be implemented, 68 were actually implemented, 67 were actually followed. And so we have, I think, pretty good data where we think we actually have very reliable sources. Everything here is going to be robust to outliers. I'm just going to give you the full sample. Okay. So our first result is that there is, on average, a positive gain to consolidation. It's about 40,000 Uganda shillings. If we normalize that by the size of the plots, that ends up being about 8% of the underlying valuation of the land. Okay? I think that's probably a reasonable estimate. As you move around, you can see that we have some outliers on the top. But as you control for outliers, it doesn't really change that. It's somewhere between 7 and 9%, depending on what you do. We think that's probably a pretty good estimate of the gains of consolidation that exists here. You can also see that there's a lot of heterogeneity in that. That makes a lot of sense, right? This is a place where farmers are going to have lots of different reasons for wanting to trade. But on average, it's something that looks like there's potential for trade. Okay. If we embed this at the trade level, and we do and analyze it at the trade level, places where farmers are gaining land, it doesn't look like they're getting all that much differences between consolidated and non-consolidated trades. Right? Turns out the place that most of this is being generated is places where somebody is losing land. Okay? So the types of transactions that look like there's going to be benefits are ones where one person is getting consolidated land and the other person is getting slightly larger amounts of land. Those are the types of transactions that turn out to have the highest amount of valuations. Okay? The other thing you can see here, the dotted line there is our rental prices. Right? If we ask people about the rental price of land, you'll notice that the differences in change in willingness to pay as a response to land size is actually flatter than the rental price. Okay? But not very easy to see in that picture is actually there is a transaction cost that's embedded in those things. So it turns out there's a transaction cost for trading, which is in the magnitude of about 50,000 shillings, so about the same size as the consolidation gain, that's actually leading to those changes. Right? So if we take that transaction cost and we take our willingness to pay data, and we map it back into that original decreasing returns graph, we actually match the pattern very well. So most of that decreasing returns that we're observing in the lease rates actually are being generated by these transaction costs, at least in our data set. Okay? So it looks like we actually have linear returns here with the decreasing returns actually embedded in basically transaction costs that are floating up from the back end. Okay. Third question we had is how many of these swaps can we identify that had positive gains? It turns out about 30% of our swaps, the one-for-one swaps that consolidate somebody, had a positive expected return. Okay? That's actually a very, very high level because we are only basically picking these things based on a set of observations that gave us identification. But nonetheless, we have actually, I think, a very good outcome in terms of the amount of trades. And then the last thing we might want to do, I don't have time to talk about this, but I'm happy to talk one-on-one. We also then look at this at a bunch of different ways of doing trades. I'll just give you two headlines. One is you have to use money, right? So if you were to try to do this just purely with matching of just transactions without money, you only get about 20% of the returns. If you try to do it with just observables, you can get about 50% of the returns. And then if you're inducing farmers by having them give you reports in an incentive-compatible way, you can get about 75% of the returns. Right? So it looks like there's gains to be had for more complicated market designs, but the trade-offs here are a little bit more unclear in terms of the difficulty of actually doing those types of implementations versus something that's more simple where you're just offering based on set prices. Okay. So conclusions, our bilateral swaps turn out to be implementable and popular. Our data reveals there's positive returns to consolidation. About 30% had a positive surplus. And we have a lot of really nice data that gives us this ability to be able to evaluate different types of designs. It looks like somewhat more sophisticated designs are better, but there are clear trade-offs essentially when you get to the top between things that are fixed price based on observables or things where you're actually inducing them with prices. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Thank you. So I think we'll take questions for 5 minutes if people can come in with their questions, and then I think we'll let Tom answer them all at once. I guess, I mean, maybe I'll just ask one question. I'm just curious on how this was implemented, and I haven't looked at the paper in a lot of details, but I think lots of people may have questions about how did you get farmers, 70% to participate in this, so kind of how did you present the experiment to them? And then the second question is like when you say implementable, I mean, obviously this was done in a certain,
in a certain context.
Yeah, so just kind of curious.
Yeah, so the first thing, obviously I didn't talk very much about the implementation details here. When we first came in, we were talking about it as basically helping farmers do consolidation. So a lot of the description was in terms of consolidation. The proportion who are willing to be in it were relatively large. So 70% is, I think, actually quite high in terms of the amount that are actually coming in and wanting to do this. Our pilot village was lower, so I think there was some word of mouth that is something that is reasonable for them to do. And the implementation is actually pretty hard. So because you have to teach them these BDM mechanisms, which are actually very complicated, you have to spend a lot of time in teaching them how to do that. So basically, we build that up starting from a place where they're trading coupons that have a certain amount of money, and then doing it with buys, and then doing it with sells, and then doing it as swaps. So we go across basically all those 4 things in about half a day, and then we walk every single field so they know what they're trading. And then at the end of that, basically, we have them go home and talk with their families so that they can talk with them and come up with valuations before we get elicitations. So it's actually pretty time intensive to do the experiment. Our goal here was to get as good a data as possible, so that's what we were doing on this particular.
Thank you. Yeah, more questions?
Yeah. We were not able to sort on quality because we were, it was us picking the things ex ante. So actually the only things we were doing here was picking them based on size. Now we think there's correlation between size and quality in this context because when we look at the maps, all the small pieces of land are kind of clustered. So we are in some way selecting on quality in the sense we're selecting things of similar size. But we don't have any observables on that. Right? And that's a little bit why I think there's a lot of heterogeneity in terms of those things. When we look at the residuals relative to what we have, there's correlations in those residuals. So for instance, when farmer 1 thinks there's a higher valuation, farmer 2's reluctant to sell that, so they're picking it up themselves. But we don't have great observations on that when we're doing the targeting. Yeah.
I was under the impression that sometimes farmers want to hold the portfolio of plots in different locations because the exact rainfall or the soil quality is not the same.
Yeah, so I think that's a good hypothesis of why there is some fragmentation. We're not observing that. Or maybe we are observing that, but it's heterogeneous. Right? That's the way I would think about this, is on average, there's a positive returns, but it's not 100%. And so that's one of the reasons we were wanting to do this, is understanding whether it's the case that their portfolio is like that for a reason, or if it's that is a market design problem that it's hard for them to fix it themselves, right? And so that's one of the reasons we're doing this type of work right now, is that we really want to make sure that if we're offering these types of interventions, it's something that is what they want to do as opposed to what we think they want to do. That's the way I would put that. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry, I'll go learn
So I think we
something.
have a lot of questions. Why don't we hold on to our questions for the end, because we are 25
Okay.
minutes in. And so Tom, we'll have a panel Q&A for 20 minutes at the end. So then just note your questions and ask them after. Thank you, Tom.
Perfect. Thank you.
So next, we have Klaus, who's going to tell us about evaluating the SVAMID-VAS scheme. Klaus, you have 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So before this is a paper together with Daniel, who is here, with Pat, who is also here, and Ima, IIM Ahmedabad, Hari Nagarajan, and Abhiman Das, who unfortunately couldn't be here. And I would like to thank also the Ministry of Panchayat Raj, who has been sponsoring this scheme and who has been very supportive and effective in helping us to get the data that we actually needed to do this evaluation. But of course, so I think the motivation is that credit effects through land titling have been very elusive in the literature, even if the titling activated land and labor markets or affected attitudes. We see virtually no, especially in rural areas. I think there are some studies that show that credit effects have been observed in urban areas where you have a functioning land registry. And of course, large-scale land titling project allow us to, or in this case, the SVAMID-VAS scheme allows us to check whether the digital integration with banks actually makes a difference there. And I think that is what we are going to implement, to look at. SVAMID-VAS was a large program to title habitation land. And I think the important thing is two aspects there. First of all, that this habitation land, because of the characteristics of India, could not be, you couldn't get any title for that before. So I think we really have a situation where you don't have any sorting or you don't have to be concerned about anything. Second, I think it's very clear that this program was titling residential land only of villagers, not agricultural land, so that provides us a clean identification of we shouldn't observe any effects on agricultural land, counterfactual. And the program was implemented, I'll tell you a little bit more about that, in a phased manner. Of course, all of these land titling programs, I think you do means you get mapping, I think like you did with your satellite imagery, you map these things. But so I think we can differentiate the impact of drone flying, which would allow us to check for expectations and anticipation, which provides a second falsification. We also have, and that is thanks to the Department of Ministry of Panchayat Raj, a very rich set of administrative data for more than 40,000 villages in the entire state of MP. That is separately, we have so we have data on land records, transfers, and charges. Charges are exactly that you register, I mean, you implement a charge. I don't want to go into the whole detail of how that goes. Or the bank has a direct access to implement a charge. So we have the annual data on Kashra, which is the number of registered parcels. That is just something that mechanically should be increasing as a result of the program. We have half-yearly data on land transfers, and that allows us to check on the land market activity. And of course, we have quarterly data on charges, which is the pledging of land for mortgages and the associated amount. What do we find? We find significant and robust land market and credit supply effects, but no impact on agricultural land that was unaffected by titling, which means that the legal document, award of the legal document is really critical. At the same time, the effect sizes remain quite modest, consistent with, and we find some descriptive evidence of banks learning to actually deal with that, which I think is also very consistent with what we would expect. And of course, I think it also means, and I think that banks are learning to really use these products. I think that provides a very interesting avenue for follow-up research, because certainly there is enormous potential from an equity perspective, both in terms of gender and in terms of landless people who cannot get documentation for the agricultural land that they cultivate. And especially since tenancy is illegal in most Indian states, I think that has significance. So I think we can actually see whether we can leverage this access to habitation land and credit access for investment both in agriculture and non-agricultural activity. We also look a little bit at heterogeneity of credit effects across villages in two respects. First, which is the most interesting from a policy perspective, MP has a significant share of tribal villages. And of course, given that there are restrictions on transferability in tribal villages, we would expect that the effect sizes would be insignificant or much smaller there. And that, I think, would give us some handle on the importance of the regulatory environment into which these programs are being introduced. And the second one is the proximity to bank branches. And of course, I think what we, so I'm giving it away here, we find surprisingly enough that there is little impact of the distance to bank branches, which I think is consistent with the digital channel. That really, and I think in India you have a very strong digital ecosystem, so I think that is where the access to the bank branch actually matters much less, and that of course is different from some earlier results. I think there are also some two tentative results that we look at RBI data, which people in India first thought, I think we had some bets there. I won the bet because I told them that administrative data would be much better than bank data. Bank data are quite limited, or I think so we do a lot of gymnastics with the bank data. I'll tell you more about that if we have time. But we find insignificant effect, and that of course means that the administrative data is really much superior in granularity. But at the same time, there is some suggestive evidence that the gender gap in access to bank accounts actually was slightly closed through Zetzvam-Witwer. And we also did some things on geospatial, where we look at effect of build area, which I think I will show you later. So I think this program was launched in 2020 with two main components. One, of course, is the legal one, because the states had to adopt, given that village land was traditionally one survey number, and nobody, I mean, the British were not interested in that because there was no revenue from it. So the legal one was the amendment to the laws. Second one was from the physical infrastructure, was the establishment of cross stations, which is continuously operating reference stations, so you can get very precise 2 centimeters, 3 centimeters drone imagery. That, of course, is critical for the mapping, especially these small habitation areas. That is an India-wide program, 350,000 villages notified. I show you the data on the implementation has actually proceeded very smoothly, so I think there's an enormous potential for equity impact. Why did we choose MP? Because because it's a clean differentiation. I think Gujarat and Maharashtra actually had some under the Bombay presidency historically. There were some possibility of getting property cards. That was not the case in MP. It is a large state. It's below the average, so it's not that we are biased to southern states where everybody says these things can be done immediately. In any case. And I think what is important that the legal and infrastructure conditions were put in place. So there was a digital record management from the beginning. Charge creation was automatic, so bank could access that system, and also the courts are digitized. So if you want to foreclose, even though I think foreclosure is not something that is very common there, of course, because people rely on the reputation effect. And of course, it's these elements were there in difference to other states, and about 30% is tribal. And of course, the existing literature is very sparse, so I don't have to go that. This is how it looks. I think I don't want to go in detail. I mean, they do the course, the station, they organize Gram Sabhas, and they do the drone survey, and then they finally, after being these maps validated, this is the process. And of course, I think what is important, the legal process of actually, after you have the map, you need to actually resolve all of the different claims. So I think MP has about 82% of, so I think this is the 3 stages. So the notification is the 350,000, which I told you. So they were, I mean, because of course you need to legally notify that you can actually start the survey and the adjudication. DF is drone flying, so we have about 94% completed nationally, but with a big, and I think that is virtually everywhere. Map creation is that the map goes back, that is and then I think 41% actually completed the distribution of property cards. Sorry, I can show you that. So I think this is in terms of the timeline for the drone flying, or maybe I should, that So we have the core stations mapped here. You see that the drone flying is very, I think was mostly done between 21 and 22, a little bit in 23. And then the second one is the distribution of property cards. So that took much longer. And in 24, 25, that was mostly completed. So I think if you map that, I think you see that the adjudication actually, that mapping is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for such impact. So on the data, we have the implementation timeline at village level, and of course the unit of treatment is the village. We have the administrative data from the land registry, number of the residential and agricultural parcels from 2018 when they started to digitize the system. We use it from 2020. Unfortunately, the gender field there is empty, so otherwise we would have been very happy to do gender analysis, mutations, and charges, which I have already explained. We have data from RBI for about 1,600 centers in the state, number of loans and deposit accounts, plus balances by gender and sector. And we have spatial and census data, economic census and population census, as well as the location of the 4,800 bank branches, which we use to allocate, and I will show you that, the bank branches to the treated villages. And then I think we have some spatial data, 2018 rice cultivated area and forest area, where I show you that in the descriptives, and also the build area at 6-monthly interval from the World Settlement Footprint as an alternative outcome indicator. If we look at the descriptives, we see that intention to treat is positively correlated with economic activity. And of course, that is partly also because you need to have suitability for core stations. So I think, but of course, since we are not looking at the, since we are comparing only areas that where drone flying was done, we see that the actual treatment was actually negatively correlated with economic activity. So that means that if there is any, if anything, our estimates would be a lower bound. So what is the identification? Of course, we rely on heterogeneity robust DID using the estimator and use the staggered rollout of the PC distribution across the villages as quasi-random variation, and the date of property card distribution, which is the legal act as the treatment. Falsification tests, I already told you, so we don't have to worry about that. In terms of outcome variables, these are just the administrative data to illustrate that. So we see that definitely there was an increase. The program did have some effect. We have also an increase in residential mutations. This thing is, don't have to worry about, I can explain later. And we have some increase in the residential and the share of charges, even though it's very low overall, and an increase in the amount of charges per square meter, which we can take as a learning effect. The RBI data show that there is, so these are what I told you before, that there is a big gender gap. I think 31% of women have, the deposit accounts is 31% by women. The loan account is only 13%. So I think clearly there is, women save more, but they don't don't get loans for it. So if we look at the effects, we find for residential land on the land markets, which is the number of mutations half yearly, that the PC issuance caused a significant increase in residential market activity. It's a small effect, but it's quite significant that it increases over time and persists, of course. And if we look at agricultural land, we see essentially nothing, which means that this is quite at least supportive of our hypothesis. We look at the number of charges registered. I think we see pretty much the similar thing. For residential land, we see an increase. For agricultural land, we see the thing is flat. And I think if we look at the amount of credit secured against land, you see exactly a similar thing. There was that COVID thing, which I think gives us very broad standard errors in the pre-treatment period, but I think that is not something that we have very much to worry about. If we look at heterogeneity across by tribal and non-tribal areas, what we find is that the number of mutations actually, surprisingly, I didn't expect that, that even in tribal areas you have a smaller but a significantly smaller effect on the number of mutations, but you don't have any significant credit effect, which means that regulatory provisions seem to make a difference. If we look at bank proximity, we distinguish villages, I think that was on the previous slides, that villages within 5 kilometers of a bank branch and with no bank branch within 5 kilometers. And we see that even though the effect sizes are slightly smaller, they have, for the villages farther away from the bank branches, we also see a positive effect on the number and total amount of charges. Not surprisingly, we don't see any effect on the built area because, and of course, the justification there would be that the maps allow better planning and attracting of investment. Unfortunately, MP, of course, one big hypothesis and one reason for implementing that program is that state governments expect to collect more revenue. Unfortunately, MP doesn't collect land taxes, so we don't have any evidence there. Then let me go briefly to the RBI data. So what we have is RBI data for our bank, it's for 1,600 centers that cover about 4,800 branches. But of course, mapping that to villages is quite shaky. And also, I think, of course, these branches are located in more active, economically more active areas. And the advantage is that they're disaggregated by gender and sector, whereas that would require some more details work for us to do if we wanted to do that from the administrative data, even though, of course, it's possible. And we look at the intensity and population weighted by treatment areas. So we identify essentially treatment at the bank branch level. Yes, and I think what I can show you here are the program effects. I don't want to show you all of the graphs there, are insignificant. But I think if you squint your eyes and you want to believe it, you see that there is maybe a slight increase in the number of female borrowers. But I wouldn't bet my career on that. But I think that is something, certainly, I think that is that further would be worth further investigating. So just let me conclude. I think data interoperability really seems to be a big game changer, and I think we heard a lot about that yesterday already, and of course we will hear more about that during the rest of this conference, that connectivity and remote sensing provide a lot of more opportunities. Also, I think granular administrative data allow us to detect even very small effects, and of course could be in principle pushed further. I think Swamitva illustrates that in a plausible way. MP, and of course, I mean, is the only state that established the legal and the IT conditions together, and I think that is very important because otherwise we wouldn't, and we don't see any of these effects in any other Indian state. So that it shows us that these can trigger credit supply, and there is significant differentiation by tribal regulation, and of course on the gender we need to look a little bit more. The modest effect sizes and the fact that this was only observed in MP and not in other states suggest that there is significant unrealized potential. And of course, that is both on the legal and regulatory side, because states should actually adopt these regulations in the same way as MP did. But of course, there's also potential to strengthen loan demand to match the increased supply that we seem to be observing. And for groups that have been credit constrained before, that may actually be a big, and where credit constraints were binding, that could have big productivity effects that I think would be worth further investigating. And of course, to do so, we would need to go beyond administrative data. Thank you.
Thank you, Klaus. We have about 7 minutes for Q&A, and then again, we'll do more Q&A later. So don't worry if you don't get to ask your question. Yeah, John.
I was very interested in the mutation results, the difference graph that you first showed, where it seems like there's potentially a slight decrease on agricultural land.
Yes.
Which would be consistent with people trading agricultural land because they can't trade residential land, is that right? So actually, you may have fixed an allocation problem in the agricultural market as well.
And no, I think we were thinking a lot about that, because that decrease, and I think unfortunately the mutation data is a little bit noisy. So I think I wouldn't put, but I mean definitely, and also looking at that in more detail, because also I think one thing would be conversion or that you trade in agricultural land just outside of your Abadi land, which you now can convert into legal. So I think that is something which I think we need to look a little bit more in detail. But I think that's a very good point.
But on the collateralization also, there seemed to be sort of a substitution. The magnitude was huge, like of the decrease in using agricultural land, I thought. But anyway, it's another question there.
I think it was related. So the question was, why do you think that there was no effect on agricultural land? Were the credit and land markets optimal already before? And whether you found any effect on where you improved agricultural productivity?
And of course, I think on the agricultural land, I mean, I think I would be very worried if I would find impacts on agricultural land, because if anything, you would, I mean, even substitution effects would take time. So I think, of course, we have only administrative data. I think we tried with the remote sensing, but I think in terms of, I don't think any productivity effects we can detect with the data that we have. I think the interesting thing I think, I mean, agricultural credit is so screwed up in India. I mean, it's highly subsidized. It is, so I think, I mean, I don't think we have been trying to look at that long time ago in Andhra Pradesh in the context of digitization. I think, so there's a lot of factors going on which we don't observe. So I think that is where I'm really comfortable that, and of course, as I mentioned, I think I didn't mention that in detail in the descriptives. There was a big, sorry, no, this thing doesn't, there was a big expansion in agricultural loans here. This 122 in 2021, which was a COVID-related program. So I think, I mean, there's a lot of things going on there that we can't control. And that's why the standard errors are also huge that you can, I mean, so I think I wouldn't want to make any, I would be worried if we had significant impact on agricultural land, but I'm quite comfortable that, and I think that would be pushing it too far. Lorenzo, you had a question?
Yeah, so very, very clear and great to see these big advantages of having this research level the data and data. So in the comparison with the RBI that are more aggregated, I wonder if the credit variables are measuring, however, the same thing. Like, if I understand correctly,
Yes.
the
Yes.
RBI are specifically measuring loans where land use has collapsed.
Yes, yes.
While
While the RBI, yes.
And so you would expect a stronger impact on the first one, even for a given granular.
Yes, yes. No, I think, and I mean, sorry, I didn't mention that. I mean, I think the RBI, so I think the RBI data is disaggregated by sector. So so we look at only non-agricultural lending. But even non-agricultural lending, of course, can be secured with agricultural land. So I think the administrative data are definitely much cleaner. And of course, and the other thing is that we can't map. I mean, you can open a bank account in a branch 20 kilometers from your village because your uncle lives there or whatever. So I think.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead. And then John, and then maybe we'll take a couple of questions and you answer at once.
Klaus, I'm coming from Ethiopia's experience now. We have a new law that allows a property developed on rural land can be also subject of transaction, including even to sales. So my question is, should we, as a precondition, certify separately residential land for securing bank loan, as compared to we have secured agricultural land already? Can you reflect on this, please?
Yes, no, I think that is a very good question, and I think that I see Daniel smiling there, because definitely that has been something we have been raising with policymakers for a long time, that I think having the residential land documented has a lot of potential positive effects, even in terms of village planning and local governments attracting investment that I think you would not expect from agricultural land. So definitely I think having that, and it will also allow you to gradually liberalize mortgage markets in a way that you cannot do if and of course I think that is also where I think the India lesson here is not, I mean, we know that agricultural credit is very difficult, but if we can actually use credit for residential areas to then also clean up some of the regulations on the agricultural and mortgage market. I think that would be a much more feasible policy approach. John?
Yeah, I was wondering if the charges, are any of them for securitized purchases where I'm buying a residential plot and then I pledge the plot as collateral for that purchase, or it's all I already own the plot and I'm using it as collateral?
I think, of course, that is, and that we should be able to observe. I mean, I think given that the numbers are so small, I wouldn't expect that. But of course, since we have or I think for that, right now we have only village level aggregates, but of course, if we have the parcel ID, then we would see, or if you have a anonymized personal ID, we would see whether the same person actually engages in the mutation and credit and the charge creation at the same time. So that would be the indication.
Okay. Thanks so much. So if you have more questions, please keep them for the panel. Thanks, Klaus. So next up, we have Lorenzo Casaburi from University of Zurich, who's going to tell us about land subdivision, tenure, and land use change evidence from Uganda. Thank you, Lorenzo.
Clicker, no, but you can just go like this and you should be fine.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. It's great to be back. Thanks a lot to the organizers for having our paper. I'm going to talk about land subdivisions in Uganda. And this is a joint work with a great team of co-authors, Jimmy Alane and Joseph Mivule, who's actually in the back, from the Ministry of Lands in Uganda, Martina Jacob, who's a postdoc at Zurich, and Sissi Namudu, who's a PhD student at Makerere University. Okay? So what's the motivation? Motivation is that average land parcel size is shrinking in most of the developing regions. And one way, or maybe the most important way in which this shrinking occurs, is via land subdivisions. Parcels get split across multiple owners, multiple heirs, or multiple buyers. Subdivision may change how land is used, but the direction is ambiguous. On the one hand, related a bit to some of the discussion of the first presentation about productivity, farm intensification may follow subdivisions, intensifying on smaller parcels. On the other hand, there may be conversion from farmland to other uses. So land subdivision process is central to debates on agriculture and urbanization, but evidence on its effect is relatively scarce. What happens to land around subdivision events? The debate on subdivisions, or the analysis of subdivisions, also relate to the debate on property rights. The process of land subdivisions may be affected by the strength of tenure. And on the one hand, secure tenure facilitates formal subdivisions and may facilitate the transfer of the land. On the other hand, tenure structure may also generate a demand for subdivision. For example, on layer contested rights, subdivisions may be a tool to resolve multiple claims. So thus, ex ante, the relation between tenure and subdivision is ambiguous. And the second research question of this paper is indeed, how do property rights affect the prevalence of subdivisions? So studying subdivisions is hard, and indeed most of the literature has relied on case studies and small-scale descriptive evidence. Why it's hard? We need to track individual parcels over time. We need to have geocoded land parcels, and we need to have a relatively large scale, so to have enough subdivisions to study. And so, as a result of this limitation, there is actually very limited evidence on subdivisions in the Global South, specifically. Also, just a cautionary note, maybe not important for this audience, but subdivision is related to, but distinct from fragmentation, which is, of course, very much on the first presentation. Okay. So we analyzed these questions in this paper with large-scale parcel-level evidence on subdivisions in Uganda, leveraging the Uganda National Land Information System, which is one of the most advanced in Sub-Saharan Africa. 2 million parcels, thousands of subdivisions events, information on tenure regime. And we complement these AMIN data with satellite imagery and deep learning models for land use trained specifically on Uganda. We document subdivision prevalence across different settlement types. Think of urban, semi-urban, and rural. We conduct event study designs, linking parcel-level dynamics to land use, and we study the institutional determinants of subdivision. Quick preview of the results. We find sharp transitions in land use at subdivisions, around subdivisions event, with a shift from crops that get reduced to mostly an increase in built-up area. We observe parallel pre-trends and effects that grow, persist and actually grow up to 4 years after the event. These effects are actually quite constant, somewhat surprisingly to us, across the rural-urban gradient. And the mechanism that seems to be driving this result is the transfer to new owners, as opposed to other potential mechanisms like a reduction in the scale of the parcel. When it comes to the relation between tenure and subdivision, we find that subdivision rates are higher in tenure regimes featuring overlapping rights and potential conflicts. And these results hold also when comparing basically two parcels that are next to each other but have different tenure regimes. Okay, I will maybe be brief on the literature, but again, probably the most important contribution is that we can study at scale, with large-scale AMIN data, the evidence on the consequences on subdivisions and the determinants of subdivisions, in this case in Uganda. Okay, so roadmap for the next 16 minutes. We're going to talk a bit about the setting, the data, then the two research questions. How do subdivisions events shape land use? And what is the relation between land tenure and subdivisions? And then I'm going to conclude. Okay, so in Uganda, there are 4 tenure regimes. I will not go in detail on freehold, leasehold, and customary. I'm guessing the audience know what I'm referring to. The one specific that I want to refer to is Milo. Milo is basically a tenure regime, and some people in the room, Klaus and others, have studied this extensively, that features layer rights. So title is typically on a owner, plus, at least in some of these plots, there are protected occupants. And different tenure types often coexist within the same local areas. So you can think, and I'm going to have a map, of different tenure regimes really being next to each other. And this, of course, helps comparison, as I will discuss. So by land subdivision, I'm going to refer to the formal split on one parcel into multiple titled parcels. This requires a formal process, survey, documentation, and administrative approval. You can think of different reasons. Inheritance is probably the most common, but also sales of a portion of the land. And importantly, we are going to observe formal subdivisions. We are not going to observe informal subdivisions. So you can think probably of our estimates as a lower bound if we think that in the not yet treated or never treated, there is some subdivision going on informal. Data. So since 2022, we have a collaboration with the Ministry of Lands that is about getting access to anonymized data, a lot of cleaning, preparation. Any of you who has worked with similar data knows how much work goes into get the data in shape. The data in Uganda cover freehold, leasehold, and Milo. They do not cover, at least barring some work in progress, they do not cover customary land. They have information about parcel boundaries, tenure, and transaction histories. Important limitations, again, no customary tenure, no data on Milo tenants, no informal transactions. Okay, so we have data for about 80% of the country, about 2 million individual land parcels, of which about 2/3 are geolocalized. And parcels cover about 35% of the zones for which we have data, with massive variation. You see that in central and west and southwest, the coverage is high. In north and east is much lower because that's where the customary regime prevails. The coverage spans rural, semi-urban, and urban areas with roughly comparable number of parcels in the 3 types of settlements. So just some descriptives. We can trace parent-child links in transaction histories and shape files. We see a growing rate over time. Last year, about 2.5% of the parcels experience a subdivision in a given year. and it's substantial and comparable, this subdivision rate, in all the 3 settlement types. Okay, I'll be brief on this, our land use, land cover data. There are off-the-shelf products that are available from 2016, I think, that are at the monthly level, 10 by 10 meter, that with land categories such as built area, crop, trees, etc. These products have broad coverage but limited Uganda accuracy. So we use this as a starting point, but then we trained a deep learning model using specific images from Uganda, and basically the accuracy goes from about 28% to 60%. So this delivers a major improvement in the confidence we have about this data. And for now, at least we collapse this data at an annual level, even if, again, this land use classification is available at the monthly data for now. Okay, so first research question. How does land use evolve around subdivision events? And of course, to tackle this study, we're going to implement event study. Sorry, to tackle this question, we're going to implement an event study design. So what's the event? The event is the first observed subdivision of a parent parcel. Okay? So it's going to be an absorbing treatment. And the land use outcomes are measured, there's some caveats here, but they are measured within the original parcel footprint, so at the parent parcel level. Okay? And we use, of course, staggered if and if. We use Callaway-Santana. So far, results appear to be robust to alternative estimators, but some of these robustness checks are still in progress in terms of alternative samples, alternative specific definition. So, and I should have mentioned, a lot of this is work in progress, just as a caveat. Okay, so if there is one result I want you to take from this presentation, is this one. So this is an event study around these subdivisions, and we see that basically around these events, there is a sharp decline in crop coverage. So up from a mean of about 25%, this goes down over the subsequent 4 years, goes down by about 10 percentage points. Okay, so very large effect. One, of course, could be concerns about anticipation, etc. So it is reassuring that the pre-trends appear to be super flat, and then right at the time of approval, on which, by the way, there is some uncertainty because there are delays, etc., you see an increase that then goes, a decrease, sorry, that then goes up in absolute value over time. Okay? So subdivision events appear to induce a sharp reduction in crop cultivation, and conversely, it appears that the most important category that increases is built area. Okay, so we see mostly a shift from crops to built area, some increase in like scrub and shrub as well. So we don't see much going on grass, just the numbers are very small, and on tree coverage. Okay. Okay. Somewhat surprisingly to us, these patterns are very similar across different settlement types: rural, semi-urban, and urban. Of course, the magnitudes, the baseline magnitudes of crops and built are different across these 3 areas, and even the percent effects are somewhat different. But in terms of qualitative evidence and qualitative patterns, sorry, these are very comparable across the three types of settlements. Maybe let me skip this. So when I think about the impact of subdivisions, one can think of multiple mechanisms. The 3 most important ones, at least we have been thinking of, are changes in scale, right? We go from a larger plot to smaller ones. Changes in owners, and then potentially resolution of frictions. If the subdivisions is a formalization of different claims on the same land. So again, work in progress. For now, the one we are focusing on is the change in owners. So how do we do this? We estimate analogous event studies around the transfers that do not involve a subdivision, so where there is a change in owner, but basically no change in size. Okay? And we find very similar effects. So both subdivisions, which you can think of as a partial sale or partial inheritance, and transfer, that transfer the entire plot, appear to facilitate the allocation of land to owners with different intentions, in particular from crops to buildings. And importantly, in our setting, subdivisions is often a prerequisite for such transfers. Dividing a parcel is how landholders sell to multiple buyers, or that's how they formalize inheritance among heirs. Okay, and so this, again, preliminary analysis suggests that the change in ownership is likely a major contributor to this change in land use that we see around subdivision events. Okay, in the last 5 minutes, I want to talk a bit about determinants of subdivision, in particular, the role of land tenure. So as I mentioned, of course, land tenure shapes rights, coordinations, and incentives to reorganize land. Raw tenure comparison across different areas may simply reflect different institutional or environmental feature, and we exploit a nice feature. Well, I don't know if nice is the right adjective, but it's quite an important feature of this setting, which is multiple tenure systems often coexist within small areas. And so we can compare nearby parcels under different tenure regimes and explore how coefficient about, for example, different tenure rights evolve once we include more granular fixed effects in our regression model. So the question is, holding local conditions fixed, does tenure predict subdivision? An important feature is also that, for example, for Milo, these are very relatively stable tenure characteristics. So again, the unit of analysis is the parcel, which allows us to compare outcomes at a very granular level. The outcome is subdivision or other land market outcomes. And so I compare the effect of Milo, which is this tenure regime with overlapping rights, controlling for increasingly precise geographical fixed effects from county level to 1 kilometer, 1 by 1 kilometer square cell, so really, really small. We can go even more granular. And what we find that Milo parcels, the tenure regime with these more overlapping rights, experience more subdivisions. So in general, this is a cross-sectional regression. About 2.3% of parcels in freehold and leasehold experience a subdivision over a 6-year horizon, and this goes up by 3 percentage points in the Milo. And as you can see, the result is very stable once we include more granular fixed effects. Okay, it doesn't move much. Once you control for, I don't know, county fixed effects, results don't change much if you go more granular, put this very detailed grid fixed effects, which sort of is reassuring in terms of interpretation. And suggests that institutional, not purely locational differences drive this comparison. More generally, Milo experience lower amount of collateralized loans, lower assessed value, consistent with some of the previous research. This is true both in rural and in urban areas. And one thing I should mention is that one concern, of course, about these registries, we came up a lot yesterday, is that, you know, the registries are created and then they are left there and nothing happens. We don't see this. We see that, for example, in Uganda, about 20%, if not more, of parcels experience a transfer over a 5-year period. So these are very active markets, formal markets, of course, with some variation across places, but it doesn't seem to be the case that the registry is just a snapshot that then becomes old very quickly. Okay, so let me conclude in the last 2 minutes. So we provide large-scale evidence on land subdivisions, innovating on a literature that has mostly relied on small-scale studies and descriptive evidence. To do so, we leverage the collaboration with the Ministry of Lands in Uganda and access to the Uganda National Land Information System. We combine this with Uganda-trained deep learning to track land use, land cover land use at the parcel level. We find that around subdivision, cropland declines and built-up land rises. And look, I didn't show this, but vegetation indexes go down, consistent with, you know, land use changes. These patterns appear across the rural-urban gradient, so not just in urban areas, but also in semi-urban and rural areas. And we find that tenure matters for the propensity of subdivisions. Parcels under Milo subdivide more, and also have other lower measures of market activity, both on the credit and on the assessed value. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Lorenzo. About 7 minutes for Q&A on this paper. Please come in with your questions. And feel free to take them all at once if you prefer, whatever you want. Yeah.
Just a question about you. So one thing you might be able to do is when you have subdivision events, the amount being subdivided may give you predictions on whether it's being turned into a house or something else.
Sorry,
So if you have a large piece of land being split, if it's a house, it's likely to be a very small subset of that, so a fraction of it, versus if it's being split for subdivision.
yeah, so especially just because the way I didn't go into it, but the way we measure this is the share of pixels in a parcel that are classified as buildings. So I should have mentioned it. That's how I interpret the outcomes. Yeah, but I agree. Sorry, you said I should take more questions.
Yeah, you can take more questions. To use the mic, you just press on that button that's in front of you. Go ahead. Yeah.
Thank you for your nice presentation, and I have 2 questions. The first one is, according to your study, subdivision is reducing agricultural land and increasing the residential land. Is that the subdivision because of the subdivision problem or land use and building permit problem? I want information on that issue. And in addition to that, is there any scheme or strategy for land consolidation in Uganda situation? Because as known, whenever you subdivide a parcel more than many times, it reduces in size and it leads to fragmentation. And in order to reduce this fragmentation, land consolidation schemes are essential and being practiced in different parts of the world. And what about the Uganda's experience toward this land consolidation? Thank you.
So the second question is, Tom and John's. sorry.
We have lots of people online.
But yeah, I'll answer more seriously later.
More questions? Come in. Lorenzo's memorizing them all. At the back. Do you want to step up to the mic? Yes. Do you want to come here?
It's great to see that Milo land has been subdivided because it's a huge area. At least 1 mile times 1 mile, right? So how big are the parcels within the Milo? And you said subdivided. Actually, what happened? The former cultivators continue to cultivate while paying money. So what happened there? Mm-hmm. And also, I want to see the difference in cultivation sites between Milo and other areas.
Klaus?
Yes, 2 questions. One is, do you have changes in land value, which I think would be quite interesting to see what is there. And then second, of course, I mean, you're only comparing, or what do you think, I mean, being limited to formal and only formal transactions, of course, is a significant barrier, especially since that may also be, I mean, I don't think there is, I think there are significant differences between Milo and customary in terms of formalization. So I think I was wondering whether you thought of actually using satellite imagery to see what is the propensity to subdivide and use that to actually get barriers to, or what is the barriers imposed by formal tenure on likelihood of subdividing, and then of course also on land value changes.
Yeah. Maybe let me answer some of these, unless there is there's one. Oh, hi Jimmy. The other coder is in the room. He was presenting somewhere else.
Thank you very much for the study, Professor Kasaburi. I think my name is Smith. I'm from Uganda, and I have worked with him on a number of things. But I wanted to contribute something particular, that in Uganda, land belongs to the people. So because land belongs to the people, it's a personal property. So that what means is that the population use that land to meet their economic needs through sales. So it is majorly the policy question, and now Uganda is grappling on how to go back now to consolidate that land, because subdivision will not give us any better economic outcomes in the long run. So this study points out key policy issues that the government is handling. But the good thing is that, like what Dr. Klaus is saying, majorly this is in the urban and the peri-urban areas, but in other parts of the country, the land is still big in square miles. And so government is now introducing in new registration models. First of all, consolidation of land based on economic interests. So, I mean, people and families can come together out of an economic interest and consolidate the already subdivided land for purpose of farming and things like that. So now that's the policy direction. Of course, I have my permanent secretary here. She can substantiate. Then the second point is we are introducing in a new registration regime of certificates of customary ownership. Now, these ones register sparse land, quite big land for almost square miles, to allow work within the principles of big land rather than subdivision. So I wanted to provide that information. But we agree with the study. The study indeed points out a direction that is not sustainable in the long run economically. Thank you.
How much time I have to answer? 1 minute? So let me very briefly.
1 minute.
Yeah, very briefly. So I think a couple of questions point exactly. This is, maybe I should let, yeah. Ubi Mayor.
I'm the PS, Permanent Secretary, Minister of Lands. Klaus, of course, I know, even Professor I know. And he has properly put it that land is being divided. But what are the factors? Let me first say my name is Mrs. Okalaindokas, and I've been in the land sector for the last 8 years. But what he said, which is correct, is that land belongs to the people. The government only holds about 7% of the land because it only holds public land. So in the Milo, what he was talking about covers about 2/5 of the land. And why was it called Milo? Because it was given to 40 chiefs who then divided the land among their children and sold some. And this is a type of freehold. It doesn't have it is a freehold, but they inherit. So that's why land is divided. You know, in our culture, when you're a boy, you're supposed to own land, but these days they have even gone to the girls. So the land is fragmented. But what is the government doing about it? The government has now started a new policy of non-fragmentation. We are trying to sensitize our people to hold land together. And we are getting in some investments on land in agriculture. And we are saying if you are going to benefit, you will only benefit when you hold land together to grow crops and protect the environment to such an extent that your land remains productive. And you know where Uganda is. It is in the heart of Africa, and it is very, very well endowed with arable land. So we are trying to do that. And now this policy is going to help us in the land use, because the ministry, our ministry, is the one which directs people how to use their land. But as you said, 70% of our land is still customary, owned by clans, and we have seen people now going into investing into the land, not only agriculture, but where we have minerals, people have gone to share there. But also I should tell you that Uganda's population is growing very fast. and we cover only 240 square kilometers of land. You know, we are surrounded by lakes, and we can't expand into Kenya. We can't go to Tanzania. We can't go to Rwanda. So we have to now concentrate on sensitizing our people how to live together. Actually, next year we are emphasizing housing as a major factor, and we're going to go up. Because land cannot be expanded, we want to sensitize people on how to live in an environment where there are many in flats, maybe 10 to 15 floors, and they leave the rest of the land for use. So that's where we are going, and I was very impressed. You picked a lot about Milo, but I think you left out the biggest chunk, which is customary. And if you came back to study now, customary is doing much better in organizing themselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Carmen.
I'll take 20 seconds.
Go for it.
Two high-level things. One, I started working on land only a few years ago. I was working on something else before. And land is by far the thing on which you get, as a researcher, more policy interest. By far. Every time I travel, every time there is a conference, there is debate. So this is very rewarding for researchers, and it's great to have the inputs by Madam Dorcas and Mr. Smith. It's just exactly what we want as a researcher, this type of dialogue. Second, we just signed a new MOU, I think, a few days ago, and so I know that now customer is gradually being incorporated in the NLIS. And so maybe in the next conference, we are going to be able to present a paper where we also can look at customer as part of the analysis. I won't go longer since I know I'm a bit out of time.
And there'll be time at the end. We can make a lot of points at the end. John, last but not least, social networks and factor misallocation in agriculture. John Lozier from our very own World Bank. Thank you.
Hi, so hopefully it will turn unfuzzy in a second. This is joint work with Daniel Agnes, who's at Maryland, Florence, who's here, and Jeremy Magruder, who's at Berkeley. So what motivated this is there's a large literature that's documented substantial misallocation of land and labor across farms. That is, there are some farms that are very large but are relatively unproductive, and there are some farms that are very small that seem very productive. There's some questions over how much of this reflects genuine dispersion in productivity across farms and how much reflects measurement error or some sort of decreasing returns to scale, but there's a general consensus that some interventions that enable the reallocation of land across farmers have been shown to increase productivity. Some of them relate to incomplete property rights, some relate to barriers to off-farm work. That is, many households don't engage much in agricultural labor markets. Some households may have a challenge in renting out their land or selling their land. Many of these frictions, we expect them to reduce the number of trades. That is, we expect them to result in farmers who have too much land failing to rent out any of their land, farmers who have too little land failing to rent in any land. Instead, what we find in our data, and this is true in a number of other countries in Africa, a large number of households are actually actively engaged, either in renting in or renting out their land, or hiring in or hiring out labor. And so this is going to motivate us to ask, why doesn't this rentals and hires, why isn't it correcting this problem? That is, why do we still observe some farms that are very large and seem unproductive, and some farms that seem very small and are very productive? So we did an exercise to convince ourselves that this could be important. So we went and took a standard exercise in this literature on misallocation, which says, okay, we see this dispersion in production per hectare, production per worker across farms. How much productivity gains could we achieve if we reallocated all of that land? And then what we instead do is we do the same exercise, but only with the land that we observe actually being rented. And what we find is just reallocating the land that's actively being rented can eliminate 30% of observed misallocation. Now, despite that, the observed rentals achieve a small fraction of that. And that motivates us to ask the question, why aren't these observed rentals and hires more efficient? That is, when I'm renting in, or let's say when I'm renting out land, why am I not renting that land out to the most productive farmer in my community? So we're going to be studying these questions in the context of the Muyanza Hillside Irrigation Scheme in Rwanda. It's a very similar setting to our other work, where we found that there were large returns to the use of irrigation, but households that had very small amounts of household labor tended not to use the irrigation because they were constrained by the labor intensity in this setting. In this context, we have smallholder farmers. They typically rotate locally consumed staples. There's also some commercial cultivation. This is a setting where all plots, these are all rural agricultural plots we're focusing on. They've all been demarcated, and there are rights to use, rent, or sell, and we observe all of those cases happening. What's going to be particularly unique about this paper, beyond the experiment that we'll get to, is the data that we have on factor trade and agricultural production within networks. So we took all of the 110 villages that intersected this irrigation scheme and its catchments. We used the National Ubudehe Social Registry to act as a census of all of the households living in these villages. We then went and did a listing. And so for 50% of the households in our census, we identified the GPS coordinates of the household, asked basic demographics, and identified whether they participate in agriculture. We then did a smaller sample survey, which covered about 3,000 households in total over 4 survey rounds. And for that set of households, we asked them about their agricultural production on 2 primary plots. So it's going to give us detailed data on the productivity per land and per worker for these households. We asked households about every one of their rentals and up to 2 of their most hired workers, which covers about 2/3 of households' hired labor, and matched them to our census. And in addition, we did a baseline social network elicitation. So we asked households about their friends, their family, and people they talked to about agriculture, and we matched that social network elicitation as well to our census. So that gives us 110 maps that look roughly like this map on the right, where we're able to identify all of the households in the village, categorize them by their productivities, geolocate them, and identify whether for each other household in the village, these surveyed households report that household as a social connection, whether they hire in labor from them, and whether they rent in land from them. We're going to produce 4 stylized facts on agricultural land and labor markets in this setting. First, they're relatively active compared to other African countries. 80% of farmers reported renting in or out or buying or selling land over our 4 years of, more like 6 years, but over 6 years of data. 94% report either hiring in or hiring out labor. Comparable numbers from LSMS surveys in 5 African countries are 20 to 40% for renting in land versus 53% in our data, and 30 to 50% hiring in labor compared to 64% in our data. So a majority of farmers are participating in land and labor markets on one side or the other. The second is factors are misallocated. We're going to conduct a standard exercise that many others have done. We're going to look at the dispersion of output per worker and output per hectare across farms. When we compare the dispersion of output per hectare to another study that was looking at variation across Indian states, the degree of dispersion is on the low end. So this is still a meaningful amount of dispersion. It implies that the 90-10 ratio of marginal productivity is such that if you took a small amount of land from the 90th percentile farmer and reallocated it to the 10th percentile farmer, you would lose something like 2/3 of the production on that small unit. Now, what we're going to do now is a slightly different exercise. We're going to ask, are the rentals that we're observing reducing this measured misallocation? That is, do rentals systematically reallocate land towards more productive farmers? And what we find is there's a positive elasticity of plots rented in or hires, and more importantly, in the share of agricultural land that's owned or the share of labor that's coming from the own household, or negative elasticity to TFP. That is, for more productive farms, they're renting in a larger share of their land and they're hiring in a larger share of their labor. And this makes sense. It means that more productive farms need to rely on land and labor markets in order to increase their scale. This is consistent with evidence from China, where there was a finding that legalizing rentals increased the elasticity of farm size to TFP. That is, farmers use land markets to scale up when they're relatively more productive. Despite that, these elasticities are very small relative to what an efficient benchmark would suggest. So the rentals are not doing nearly enough, and that goes back to our original motivating figure, at least from one perspective. Our new stylized fact is we're going to show that factor trade is concentrated locally and socially using this network data. So when we compare a random pair of households in the village to a pair of households that are socially connected, a social connection has about a 13 times higher probability of renting in and a 7 times higher probability of hiring in. For reference, these social connections represent about 5% of the social network, and this implies that about half of rentals in these villages are just within this relatively small social network. We also note, so Lorenzo has a paper where they induced rentals using subsidies. They went back and looked at these rentals and asked people, oh, how are you related to this person you're renting in from? And this corresponds to about the same fraction as they report being like friends or family along those bilateral rentals. We find similar magnitudes for distance. Proportionally, it seems like social connections are relatively more important for land transactions. Physical distance is relatively more important for hiring. And we'll try to unpack a bit why we think that's the case. So in order to think about this, we're going to write down a model of inefficient land and labor trade that's induced by matching frictions. So what a lot of people have in mind when they think about frictions in land and labor markets is some sort of bilateral friction, like I don't like working for other people, or I face some costs of walking to another plot. Many of these frictions would show up effectively the same as a change in the rental rate that a household's willing to post. If a household posts, say, I'm willing to offer a given rent for land, a household that lives near to me might be more willing to rent out to me, might be more willing to work for me. What we're going to add to these models is a distinct friction that we're going to call matching frictions. This corresponds to an extra cost to sustain a given rental or a given hire from I to J, from the renting out household or the hiring out household to the farm that's renting in or hiring in. In the math, these look kind of similar, but they actually generate very different predictions. In the case of our matching frictions, we've constructed them so that what they're doing is increasing this rate of match destruction. That is, if I rent out to someone, I need to keep contracting with them, re-agreeing with them in order to sustain that rental. These increased matching frictions reduce the efficiency of trade by reducing the responsiveness of trade to the productivity of the match. That is, how productive is the hiring farm. In contrast, iceberg frictions simply reduce the probability that I trade with someone, and this has ambiguous implications for efficiency. If somebody's further away, yeah, I'm going to be less likely to work for them, but it's not that I'm going to be differentially less likely to work for someone farther away who's relatively less productive. And so our key prediction that we're able to use to separate bilateral ties that affect matching frictions from ones that don't is that matching frictions should increase the persistence of rentals and hires, and they should increase the TFP elasticity of rentals and hires. So we're going to test this using social connections and distance for both rentals in and hires in. And the key initial prediction is that if social connections or distance are affecting matching frictions, they should increase the rate of match destruction. That is, these rentals and hires should break down more quickly, while iceberg friction should not. What we find is, first, in our setting, there's very high turnover of rentals and hires. Only about a quarter of them are persisting every 1 to 2 years. And social connections increase the persistence of rentals by 70 to 80%. So, and we're getting at that by seeing, okay, when you're socially connected to someone, how much more likely is it that that rental or hire persists from one round to the next round? Using qualitative evidence, we find that this is related to trust. People often say that when they're looking to rent in a plot, it's really important that they trust the person and that they're aware of the quality of the plot that they're renting in. We don't find any effects of distance, and we don't find any effects of social connections for hires. So what we're then going to do is test whether, in turn, these bilateral ties that affect matching frictions also affect the TFP elasticity of rentals and hires. That is, now that we know that, now that we find this evidence that social connections are increasing the persistence of rentals, is it the case that when I'm socially connected to someone, I'm going to be particularly likely to rent out to them if they're particularly productive? That is, does trade appear to be particularly efficient within social networks? So in order to test this, we're going to estimate whether social connections or distance increase the relative likelihood of renting out to someone if that person is relatively more productive. And this is exactly what we're going to find. So we find that social connections increase the elasticity of the probability I rent out to someone to productivity from 0.3 to 1. This is a bit maybe hard to interpret. The most important thing is just to note that this one force ends up explaining 40% of the efficiency gains from rentals. So the fact that within social networks, rentals are more efficient explains an important part of why rentals are enabling this increase in efficiency we described earlier. And it potentially also explains why, outside of networks, rentals are not enabling a larger increase in efficiency. That is, it seems that when I rent outside my network, there's a high likelihood of a dispute. Because of that likelihood, rentals break down, and because of that, I'm unable to direct rentals outside my network as efficiently as I would like. We similarly don't find consistent evidence of effects of distance or social connections for hires, which is consistent with our theory. So that motivated us to ask, okay, social connections are improving the efficiency of rentals. Can we use policy to achieve the same thing? That is, can we extend these benefits that social connections are providing in land markets to beyond social connections? And we take two approaches to think about this. The first was we ran 2 experiments. We worked with the Minister of Agriculture on developing a rental contract template that was directly intended to address the risk of disputes. And then second, we empowered government extension workers to contact farmers and register whether they were interested in renting in or out land, and then conditional on their consent to match interested pairs of farmers. We found that nobody used the contracts, and for information, we're able to really dig into the bilateral data and use a difference in difference design to find a very, very small suggestive effect, something like we created 1 rental per village, and we don't find any evidence that this substituted for connections. So it doesn't seem like this efficiency gains from social networks is attributable to information. We attempt a cross-sectional validation of the results, so we instead look at common group membership. There we find that when farmers share a common group, like being in a church or a cooperative, they're actually more likely to hire, but they're not more likely to rent. And so this suggests to us that this common group membership may be enabling some sort of information, which other work suggests is important in labor markets, but perhaps not in land. So our big takeaway from this is that strong property rights are not enough, as this is a context where we already have titling and ownership. And the thing we need to think about when we're trying to improve the efficiency of land markets is what substitutes for the role of personal trust in contracting to reduce misallocation. We tried information and contract templates. We didn't succeed. This is also a particularly narrow set. I think Tom's presentation showed that when you have these big bilateral mappings, there's a lot of, that creates a lot of opportunities for inefficiency when who I trade with matters and not just what I'm trading. Other alternatives like notarized sales or formal standardized long-term rentals may be more promising as they substitute for the need for personal trust. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. So we have 8 minutes left on this particular presentation, and then after that we'll have a good 20 minutes, I think, on but maybe a little less. But go ahead.
Hi, John. Super cool paper. Glad I finally got to see this. I was wondering, like, for policy implications or any kind of like counterfactuals, it seems like what you would suggest is like a good policy would be to increase the network centrality of really productive farmers. And I'm wondering if you could kind of do, I don't know how much of a model you guys have, but if you could kind of do, okay, if we increase the centrality of the most productive farmer by, to the 90th percentile or whatever, then kind of what kind of gains do we get?
Yeah, so I think we really have been thinking about that question from a policy perspective in terms of what would interventions look like in practice that would shape network structure. I think what we think of is often organizing farmers into groups where they can talk about agriculture is something often proposed for that. So we didn't experiment with this, but we tried to test this with our common group membership identifiers, and it seems like that didn't end up impacting things on land rentals, although it does seem to affect hiring through information. I think it's conceptually interesting, I guess, but I'm not sure if it's policy relevant, but it sounds cool.
Thank you very much. I do not know much about Africa, but in the case of Asia, labor markets are not working. The workers are engaged in very, very simple tasks like weeding, transplanting, and harvesting. Farmers are engaged in land preparation, pest management, water management. They're doing totally different things. But whole African researchers put higher labor and family labor together. That's a nonsense. Very, very surprised. Another thing is, you talked about matching and cost of matching. But in the case of Asia, share tenancy is very common, and there's a risk of shacking. But in the case of fixed rent payment in advance, what are the transaction costs? Abuse of land? Is the area irrigated? And what kind of transaction costs are you talking about?
Yeah, so for the first question, we're not doing any task-based separation. I think it's also the case here that the tasks that are taken on by the farm managers and the hired workers are going to be different. We think that might be part of why information is more important in labor markets than in land markets, because many of the sort of demands for labor vary over the course of the season. I think it's an important question. It's not one we're speaking to.
When hired workers are hired, farmers watch, monitor, always.
Yeah, so we think about, there's definitely a complementarity between the farm manager's labor and the hired worker's labor, and management is one of those important tasks. We don't observe any households where there's no household labor, so the household is always employing at least some labor in management. Definitely that's a potential source of inefficiency in these labor markets, for sure. On the shared tenants, in general, the structure we observe on almost all these plots is they're all private. There's one owner. The plot is either cultivated by the owner or it's rented in by another farmer, I guess.
So very nice. Two things. One is it is very.
Mike is not my thing. It is very interesting that you find this very active factor market just descriptively, and I think this matches a growing body of work that is finding maybe it's a recent development or maybe it's better measurement, but this market seems to be a bit more active than we thought. I'm a bit surprised about the high turnover part. I thought a lot of this matching logic would have a sort of fixed cost logic that will predict a lower duration. So can you say a bit more about why these arrangements break? Is it supply? Is it demand? Is it disputes?
We're trying to do more on that. Qualitatively, there's a couple reasons why these things break down. I think one is just I need it one year and then I don't need it the next year. That's sort of orthogonal a bit to the mechanisms we're discussing. Another is just in Rwanda, there's 3 primary agricultural seasons. There's 2 important rain-fed ones, but they partially overlap. So if I tend to grow one crop and then I don't tell the other person what I'm growing, or like I don't properly dispose of crop residue, things like that, it could originate some sort of dispute. We're trying to figure out qualitatively how we can unpack this a bit more, but those are our understanding of the biggest sources of disputes. Yeah.
So a quick follow-up. So then maybe you could look at whether I always rent to the same person, but only in one of the seasons. That would be a slightly more granular way to unbundle the turnover.
Yeah.
Actually, my question is related to the first one, and your main conclusion is the informal, actually the network you have. So empirically, I'm wondering how you identify. I have a fixed effect of your network circle, or you actually go beyond your network, because if you land to a highest productivity within your network, you still could miss the people actually the highest productivity outside. So I just wondering, and also this formal, so the network and formal titling, and also in the literature, they could have a substitute use interaction effect or something. So I just want you to comment on, because the literature typically find not actually one set of literature at least. I think you see the Klaus and also the Alain DeJambelet and Macron, they also have done that. Look, if it's informal and people usually actually the network lower your productivity, or actually it's seen not as good as if you formalize it. So this is my comment.
Thanks. Yeah, so I think this is in a setting where all of the land has been demarcated, and I don't think there's perceived tenure insecurity. We do think that sales would have some advantages over rentals in terms of the efficiency of trade outside networks. This is a bit speculative, but an advantage of sales or long-term rentals is that they can be formally registered, there's standardized terms, and it maybe doesn't matter whether I sell to somebody I don't know or whether I'm doing a very long-term rental to somebody I don't know. I don't necessarily care about their identity. And so that could resolve some of these problems, but we're just focusing on these informal rentals in this context where we're documenting that there's this increased efficiency between pairs where there's more trust.
But it's not just you sell, actually also demand. So I think it's a demand and supply. You allow them to fully transaction. So, yeah.
Great, and we can take questions now for all the speakers. So feel free to come in with your questions and position them to the person you want to ask them to, and you can have general questions to our panel of presenters since they all work on similar issues. Thank you, come in, please.
Yeah, just a follow-up to the question raised by Keith. What I haven't heard is, what is really the contractual arrangement? Is it a cash rental, or is there any sharecropping arrangement, or what is the payment mechanism? Is it upfront, or are they really paying at the time of harvest? And whether that has any effect in terms of choosing their contract partners.
Let's just take a few questions, and some of the questions multiple speakers might want to answer. If you guys want to come in with also general thinking about this session. No? Come to the table.
So a question for the first speaker. Do you observe like the crop that these farmers cultivate, and how do the consolidations and the traits vary by crop? Yeah, if you see any variation there.
I think there were some questions earlier in the first session, so everybody's gone quiet. I should have allowed you to speak up, but I think, DJ, you had a question. Why don't you come in? And feel free to introduce yourselves.
Thank you again. I just want to ask about this land consolidation issue. And also in Ethiopia, we are working on that. But I'm not sure whether it is going to be effective or not in a policy environment that doesn't allow land transactions, basically sell and transfer of land.
Yeah, I have a related question with yours. In Asia, land consolidation is becoming a really serious issue because mechanization is taking place. And it's advantageous to have a consolidated fields rather than scattered fields. Right? But in the case of Africa, some people use the hands, and maybe Ethiopia, a pair of oxen. Is there any scale economy? If there is no scale economy, consolidation doesn't matter.
But fragmentation is literally becoming a crisis level because even farmers are not producing enough for themselves, and it's affecting the urban community, and at the same time also affecting soil qualities and so on. And we got to do something about it.
Thank you for the presentations. My name is DJ. I am an economist at DEC at the World Bank. Just trying to, maybe one specific question for Tom's paper, consolidation gain. I wasn't sure where that comes from. Is it just travel distance? You just have to travel to one plot as opposed to two plots because there's no increase. So I was wondering if you see kind of intermediary like input application, whether they change, do they start renting a tractor, or do they change their? I kind of think of margins where you have two contiguous plots, like what you would do like differently. But a more broader takeaway from the session is it seems like land consolidation important and land tenure important. Like to Lawrence's paper. With improved land tenure, like basically there will be fewer subdivision, if I understood that correctly. And then maybe a little bit to John's paper, with better land tenure and with improved land rights, maybe you will be more willing to rent in your plot from somebody that you don't know. Trust matters less when markets are working well. So yeah, just reflecting a little bit at the end. So are those kind of two buckets where we're trying to achieve land consolidation and land tenure, and then the research questions that people are presenting in the session are more like, how do we get there? I'm not the best person to summarize this, but maybe just trying to summarize what I learned, but.
Great. Anyone else wants to come in? One last question, or do we turn back to the presenters? So Daniel, one more question.
Just a question to Tom, because there are, I think, policymakers in the room. For them, I think scale might be quite relevant. So, is there any suggestion that you would like to make in terms of, scaling up, or, if assuming that land consolidation is beneficial? Thanks.
Great. So maybe just going in this order, Tom, Lorenzo, Klaus, and John, and then we'll close. Yeah, thank you so much.
Great. So the first quick question about crops. The area we're working in are mostly potato farmers, and so predominantly that was the crop that was across. There was some change in crops in terms of who was, once there was trades. So we do see some variation in terms of what people are growing when they consolidate. The main gains that we have, so I'll say we did this for 1-year rentals. Partly there was a kind of a do no harm aspect. This is the first time we were trying all this. The main gains seem to be reduction in travel costs and some changeover in terms of what they were doing. Mechanization is unlikely unless you have something that is more permanent than that, because you're not going to buy a tractor or even invest in that tractor technology until you have more people kind of floating around. And so we would kind of view these as kind of the lower bound gains to consolidation because they're what you can do in terms of kind of a year. A second question that was kind of floating around was this question of what do you get for consolidation? So I think there are lots of kind of chicken and egg problems in terms of reallocation, right? So you can't really have a tractor market until you have larger farms, but you can't have larger farms unless there's a tractor market, right? That kind of floats around. There are gains to diversifying your land holdings because there's not insurance markets, but those insurance markets aren't going to really function unless people are consolidating. And so in some sense, what you're wanting to be doing here is multiple things at once. And so kind of my view is if you can construct tools that help the consolidation aspect of things, then potentially at least that's solving one of the parts. And then the other things are auxiliaries that you kind of learn about what you're substituting away for and what are the things that you're changing as you change those types of structures. So that's kind of my view is if you can try to figure out what are the problems that are making it hard to do consolidation, once you figure out better ways of doing that, then you can ask the question, can you build that into a system that's trying to tackle the things that are existing, right? So I think there is an aspect where people are diversifying because there's no insurance markets. But once you've done that, now there's kind of a countervailing force of how do you put the land back together. And I think those are kind of the challenges as we move forward. I think the last question was in terms of scaling these things up. So I have in mind in trying to help build markets. And so, the things that we're trying to build is basically scalable platforms that can be done at small levels, which is what we're doing now. But then you can have something that we kind of take for granted in kind of developing context, right? So in the US, I can go on Zillow and learn about every single house that exists. Well, you don't have that if you're looking at farmland in a developing country. And so these kinds of just technologies that now are scalable exist in other places. And if we can build those, maybe that's something that's going to be useful as we move forward. So that's kind of the long run agenda of how do we do this is can we solve or help on the market design problem, and does that help us in terms of transitioning to other places?
Also, let me address also some of the questions from before. So I think the results of our paper about subdivisions inducing changes in land use resonate a lot with the concerns of policymakers in Uganda and beyond. It's an extensive margin dimension in which there is a shift from agricultural production to other uses. And this, of course, is an important margin to study in addition to intensive margin in terms of productivity condition on cultivating. And so just the idea that the amount of cultivated land is going down is an important margin. Another question was about this informal versus formal aspect. I think, Klaus, you were asking it. So my sense there is that, so let's think through this. There may be some transactions that we don't capture. This would basically reduce any treatment effects because in the never treated or not yet treated, they are not pure, they are not good enough. So that's maybe a simple way to think through that. And then it is, to go back to some of the inputs from Madam Dorcas and Mr. Smith, it is true, like in the current version of the data that we are working on, a lot of the action comes from Milo and Freehold. Customer is gradually being added in some form with the CCOs, etc. So it may be possible to study those tenure types and the impact of subdivisions, etc. on those tenure types eventually. But I really want to stress that this type of coverage spans not just in urban areas, not just in rural areas, but across very different types of settlements. And the fact that we find very similar patterns across different settings suggests that this is not, for example, just driven to the fact that we are comparing parcels, small versus large parcels, or parcels that are very different along some other dimensions, but it seems to be a pattern that holds in a robust way throughout the part of the country, at least that we can study.
So I think I like the Zillow example. I like the joke that you know, in the U.S. or in property markets in many richer countries, it doesn't matter who you're buying from, and it barely matters who you're renting from. I think our finding is that in these informal markets, they're depending heavily on trust. We saw a presentation yesterday at a policy roundtable on a platform in Ukraine that was enabling sales and long-term leases at scale that builds on institutional reforms that enabled effectively free transfers of long-term leases and sales. It seems like a big question here is what are those processes of formalizing agricultural land markets in a way that appropriately reflects that we feel differently often about agricultural land markets from urban land markets. And it seems like many of these interventions are likely to be complementary to the types of platforms that we were seeing or other forces.
Okay, now I think since there were no questions for me, I don't have to answer anything. But I just wanted to thank all the presenters, except me. I think also to make a pitch that, of course, there will be, I mean, given that we have all of the experts on Asia here in the room, there will be more sessions where these questions will be discussed much more specifically for the case of Asia, which I think has a lot of lessons to learn. And then I think the third element really is that on Ethiopia, I think we hope that we can actually take that a little bit forward. Because as we heard also yesterday, I think there are significant efforts from the government to provide access to mechanization and access to also credit. And we think that if we can use that as a nudge and actually use because then I think that provides tangible benefits. So using that as a quasi-experimental setting where we can experiment with some of these things and where we hope that we will be able to collaborate with, or we build on the existing collaboration with Tom and John, that hopefully by the next land conference we will have something to present that is more interesting and more substantive on this. But certainly I think there's a lot of questions to be explored, and thank you all for your participation.
Thank you, everyone. I think this is coffee break now, right? Yeah, coffee break. I think there's some outside and there's also some downstairs. Yeah, coffee everywhere.
Good morning and good afternoon, good evening to those who may be joining online. I think we're 5 after, so let's get started for this session. Thank you so much for joining. My name's Robin Mearns. I'm the Director for Gender here at the World Bank Group, and really delighted to be chairing this session on inheritance and intergenerational wealth transmission. The whole issue of women's land and property rights is featured very prominently in our World Bank Group gender strategy, something that we pay a lot of attention to. And I think we've got an extremely interesting set of papers in this session on some, perhaps under-recognized aspects of this agenda, focusing on inheritance and the ways in which inheritance is mediated in various ways by social norms in influencing outcomes on the ground. So I think, this, as part of the Land and Property Research Conference, any new research on land governance, land markets, and institutions is important. But I think this really is, from a gender perspective, in terms of how to unlock women's economic participation. I think it's really key how women gain greater control over assets, women's agency, and how these play a role in promoting economic opportunities for women is really fundamental. So we have 4 super interesting papers coming up in this session, focusing on empirical evidence from Burkina Faso, Nigeria, India, and Pakistan. And they all speak to a central issue around the fact that legal and administrative reforms matter, but their effects and the ways that they play out in practice depends very deeply on household dynamics, on social norms, on implementation systems and how they play out in practice, and the incentives that shape how families respond. So a super rich set of questions. And I'm not going to summarize because we'll hear from each of the speakers their papers. But together, taken as a block, I think it really reminds us that women's asset ownership isn't only about whether a woman's name actually appears on a land record. This is, of course, vital, but it's whether women can, in practice, effectively claim, control, and benefit from those assets and property rights. So with that, let me just go straight to our speakers. Just in terms of the format, I think this has been a common format for these sessions throughout the conference. I'll ask each of the presenters to present for not more than 15 minutes. We'll then have just a few minutes of questions for clarification immediately following each one, and then we'll reserve time at the end for a fuller discussion session on all four of the papers. So with that, let me turn to our first presenter, Laura Meinson-Dick from Michigan State University, on behalf of a team, but I will let Laura explain. Over to you, Laura.
Excellent. Well, thank you all so much. This is a very new paper, so would really appreciate any comments, suggestions, thoughts that you have on it, because it's still very much active research. This is joint work with Catalina and Nico, who are at University of Illinois, and then Mayra, who is at Villanova University, looking at fertility and land rights in Burkina Faso. So the motivation for this paper is there's a large literature about linking women's empowerment with property rights. Right, these things we know are closely related to each other. Causality, I think there's some pretty good evidence that it goes both ways. There's also sort of a separate literature that looks at the relationship between women's empowerments and fertility. And we know that this whole process is extremely complex, and it's going to be mediated by things like social norms and the broader cultural context. And then any individual decisions that are being made are going to be a product of intra-household bargaining as well. All of that complexity is what makes it really interesting, but it also makes disentangling causal impacts, which is what we as economists really like to do, very difficult to do in observational studies. So in this paper, we are going to look at how fertility responds to a supposedly gender-neutral property rights reform that happened in Burkina Faso. So what this program did is it documented rights, but kind of at a household level. Documenting rights at a household level does not necessarily mean that women's rights are being documented, and as we will see, that's not necessarily the case in this example. Women were, by and large, excluded from the process, and in a secondary data set, we actually see that women report fewer land rights in treated areas than in untreated areas. Men, on the other hand, report more land rights. And then we argue that in response to this, women are changing their fertility decisions. They're basically excluded from a formal documentation process, and so they are trying to secure their land in other ways, and one of those ways that is open to women is through fertility. So women, we see, have more children. They are also, interestingly, more likely to be using modern contraceptive methods. And then when we look at men's responses, this is all in the DHS data, men actually desire fewer children in treated areas, perhaps because the land that their household has is now a little bit more finite and defined, and they don't want to split it amongst as many children. Sort of suggestive mechanism that we're thinking about. So in terms of contributions of this paper, we're really closely related to work by Donald et al. Here at the bank that looks at titling interventions in Benin and Ghana. They find that these interventions that are primarily documenting men's rights increase fertility amongst female spouses. We're going to be doing a similar exercise, but in Burkina Faso, using the experimental pilot phase of the Millennium Challenge Corporation's Rural Land Governance Project in Burkina Faso. The pilot phase rolled out across 47 treated and then paired comparison communes. So we can think about this as being sort of an exogenous change in the documentation of land rights that happens. We're then going to spatially match that treatment status with DHS survey data, so demographic and health survey data. And the reason that we're doing this is to go beyond Donald et al., who can only use household rosters to look at fertility decisions at Nline, we can get much richer data on fertility behavior, but also preferences that the DHS asks about beyond just births. And then start to think a little bit more, unpacking those intra-household bargaining processes that are resulting in the birth outcomes. More broadly, I think this paper speaks to a literature on social norms and fertility that is a really active and interesting one. So a little bit on the context that we're thinking about. First, fertility in Burkina Faso, because I know this is a land audience. Fertility in Burkina Faso is high at about 5.8 births per woman in 2012, which was the year that this program started. That's pretty close to the desired fertility rate of 5.4 for women. And there's evidence that contraceptive use is not really a constraint in terms of matching actual fertility to desired fertility. Around 34% of married women are using contraceptives, and a nice paper shows that actually free provision of contraceptives does not increase take-up. It does not lower fertility at all. Coming to the land, the part that I'm sure you all care more about, the Rural Land Governance Project in Burkina Faso was part of a 5-year compact between MCC and the government of Burkina Faso. It unrolled in 2 phases. And actually, I would really love, we're finding somewhat different results between these 2 phases. I would love your thoughts if you have ideas on how to disentangle that. So in the first phase, there were national level changes that were happening as well, so new land laws that were drafted, and there was a rollout to 17 communes that received the local programs, as well as 17 comparison communes. And then in phase 2, the national legal changes had by and large finished, and there were an additional 30 matched pairs, which were randomized into treatment and control, that got the local land offices. And so what happened in a treated commune was a local land office was created and staffed. They then drafted in each village in the commune participatory land use maps. The idea here was to document existing rights and perhaps overlapping rights that were held for every piece of land. Individuals, after this mapping process had happened, could request an APFR document. This is not a formal title, but you can think of it as sort of approaching titles. However, demand for this was quite low, much lower than the program anticipated. So we're going to be thinking about the treatment as really being about these land offices being created, community discussions that are happening around it, and these land maps happening, rather than necessarily getting a formal document for your land. The process happened by and large in a gender neutral way. Perhaps over time there was less demand among women than I think program staff had anticipated, and so fees were waived for women applicants, for instance, but there was by and large very little take up. And tomorrow you will see that the program's own impact evaluation finds a pretty substantial decrease in women's land rights within the Nline survey data from the program as well. So what we find is going to be very consistent with the program's own evaluation. We are going to use not the program's evaluation data, but instead the Demographic and Health Survey from 2021, the geolocated data. The DHS is designed to be nationally representative, but not subnationally representative, and then we are going to spatially match that with treated and comparison communes. Now, that geolocated data has up to a 5-kilometer random displacement in rural areas. So we're basically going to draw a circle around the GPS coordinates and identify the probability that a given DHS cluster falls into any commune in the country. We're going to call a DHS cluster as treated if it has more than a 75% chance of falling in a commune which was treated through the RLG program in either phase 1 or phase 2. For control, we're going to do a similar process, but just by random chance, there's not as good of overlap between DHS clusters and comparison communes. So we're going to use if either the DHS cluster has more than a 50% probability of falling in a control commune, or it's very close to a control commune, so within 10 kilometers. Even that does not necessarily get us within region of Burkina Faso within phase comparisons for every treated commune. So we're additionally going to use propensity score matching to sort of get a few additional comparison clusters that look pretty similar. We run things both with and without those propensity score matched clusters because we can't quite decide which we like better on that. For all of the control clusters, we're going to exclude them if they have more than a 1% chance of falling within a treated commune. The DHS survey, the way it works is that then 26 households are sampled per cluster. All women ages 15 to 49, so all women of reproductive age, are interviewed within the household. And then in half of households, men aged 15 to 49 are interviewed as well. We're going to restrict our sample to women who have ever cohabitated, so we're excluding children, basically. Which gives us an estimation sample of around 6,500 women and 2,800 men. And they look, by and large, fairly well balanced. Things that are not terribly well balanced are quite small in magnitude, those differences. So this matching process gives us a bit of a strange sample. So you can see all of the DHS clusters in black with the 5-kilometer displacement mapped around there. And you can see that red dots are those DHS clusters that we have identified as falling within a green treated commune. And then the orange communes are the control, so you can see there are definitely some DHS clusters within them, but others that are close by that we are pulling in through our additional matching process. Okay, so our empirical strategy, we have data from the 2021 DHS, and we are going to be comparing treatment versus control communes. So regressing outcomes for woman I in commune C in region R, controlling for a whole bunch of demographic characteristics at baseline, including the number of children that she had before treatment began for that phase, so that we're going to use the phasing in timeline, clustering our standard errors at the commune level. Yes, 5 minutes, okay, quickly then. So we are additionally going to use birth histories that the DHS has, really rich data on birth histories and contraceptives. So we're going to use that retrospective data to construct an unbalanced panel over the fertile period for every woman, and then sum that up over relevant time periods. You might be thinking this sounds like an event study. That is definitely where we are heading, but I don't know that the slides got updated after I put in the event study graphs. So our results. First of all, land rights. The DHS does ask, do you have rights to land or your house? And we find a marginally significant negative impact on women's land rights and insignificant impact on men's rights. When we break that out by the phase of the RLG program, we find stronger negative results for women in phase 1, and we find statistically significant positive effects for men's land rights in phase 2. And so I think that's going to be important context in understanding the rest of our results, because we do find in fertility as well, we find different patterns of fertility between phase 1 and phase 2. So thinking about phase 1, panel A at the top is just summing up across the whole post-treatment period. For that commune, we find insignificant increases in fertility. But if we break that out into just the first 2 years of the program, while sort of program activities were happening, we find an increase there, small, marginally significant. These results are not as strong as I perhaps would like. And then again, an increase in a later period where we can think about that sort of land rights have been decided after 2 years post-treatment. When we think about phase 2, when we look at phase 2 communes, however, here we find a very different pattern. So here there's a dip in the first 2 infertility in the first 2 years while treatment is sort of ongoing. So 2 years after treatment begins, and then afterwards we get perhaps a slight increase in conceptions. Oh, the event study did come in, so we can sort of see this. This is where we're heading with this stuff. We also look at contraceptive use, and so in phase 1, we don't find significant impacts on contraceptive use, but in phase 2, we find pretty strong increases in modern contraceptive use, and most contraceptive use in Burkina Faso is what we would consider to be modern contraceptives for treated women. No impacts on women's fertility preferences. when we asked them at Endline. Now, fertility preferences are kind of a complicated thing to ask about because very few people are going to say they want fewer children than they already have, for instance. But we do find a reduction in men's fertility preferences, the number of children that men would like to have in treated communes in phase 2. So these are the men for whom they answer that they are more likely to have land rights, and we see that they want fewer children by and large. The DHS does ask quite a number of questions about decision making because, so if we see no change in women's fertility preferences, a decrease in men's fertility preferences, we see an increase in modern contraceptive use, we see perhaps an increase in actual fertility, realized fertility. To me, that seems like it's a product of inter-household bargaining. So we look at questions that the DHS has about decision making within the household. We really don't find, and this is women's decision making, we really don't find a whole lot there. So just to wrap up, in this paper we find that this land rights documentation in Burkina Faso led to an increase in men's land rights, but a decrease in women's, a decrease in men's fertility preferences, and an increase in contraceptive usage, which would be consistent with that. But interestingly, an increase in actual fertility, particularly after that implementation is complete. As I said, this project is very much ongoing, so things that we're planning to do next are looking at heterogeneity analysis, which we hope will help us unpack some of that phase 1 versus phase 2. You know, are these different ethnic groups? Is there more polygamy in in one of these phases based on just where we get the DHS clusters? Heterogeneity by if the woman has a firstborn son, which is a really important component of women securing their rights. Thinking a little bit more carefully about some of those treatment effect dynamics, using the pseudo panel, and then additionally using perhaps the full DHS sample and doing more of a quasi-experimental approach with the rollout of this across more of the country. So thank you all so much. Look forward to hearing your comments.
Thank you very much, Laura. Thanks for keeping to time. Let's just pause here in case there are any questions for clarification. Clarification only at this stage for Laura. Yes, please.
Hi, interesting work. I only had one small clarificatory question. So here you're focusing on all women who have had births before and also women who are married but don't have any children, right? Okay, that's all I wanted to ask because I thought maybe, you know, if you are focusing on women who report no births as of now, maybe the results might change slightly.
Thank you, yeah.
Okay.
Yes, we currently use all women, but I think one of the things we really plan on doing is sort of looking into, especially firstborn child, and then that would also involve looking at women without children in order to sort of tease that out, yeah.
Thank you, Laura. Yes, please.
Just on the design, if let's say a cluster has equal probability to be, you know, either on the control or the treatment, I don't know how did you choose to assign it?
Yes, so it only counts. So if it would be an equal probability of either, we would throw it out entirely. If it's more than a 75% chance of being treatment, then it's treatment. If it's more than 50% of control but less than 1%, so if it was 50-50, it would be thrown out because of this less than 1% probability of being in a treated cluster.
Okay, any other questions for clarification? Yes, please.
My name is Costa Chanza from Malawi. I would like to know why this variable on whether it's patrilineal society or matrilineal society was not included. Because if it had been included, there should have been a difference in the clustering of those colors. So I would like to know whether Burkina Faso is patrilineal or matrilineal.
So there are both in Burkina Faso, and that is something that we have looked into. The exact mapping of ethnic groups onto matrilineal and patrilineal is a little bit more complicated in Burkina Faso than I think it is in Eastern Africa. So that is absolutely on our priority list because I think it is a really important part of it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, any other? I think we had one more question for clarification at the end there.
My name is Centra. I'm from Ethiopia. the link between land rights and fertility is a focus. But in most cases in Africa, there could be also other factors that affect the fertility rate and the decision of women. So have you taken that into account?
Yeah, so we try to control for a lot of things that we can think that would be influencing fertility decisions aside from this. I think for our identification, so those things are absolutely shaping fertility, and if we wanted to predict fertility, those would be really important. But most of those factors are fairly well balanced between treatment and control. We try to control for them as well to sort of isolate this property rights mechanism. But like, absolutely, that, yeah, huge other roles.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Laura. Hopefully there'll be a little bit of time for some wider discussion at the end, but thanks very much. We'll move on now. Yes, clap for Laura. We're going to stay empirically with West Africa. We're going to switch now to Nigeria and look at the role of land and inheritance rights in different types of polygamous households. And I'm very pleased to welcome Alessia Isopi from the University of Manchester in the UK. Over to you, Alessia.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here again. This is a joint work with Jennifer Gola from the University of Bath, and exactly like Laura, also this is a new paper, very preliminary work, so any feedback, comment is extremely welcome. Polygamy is a marriage institution which, although covering and affecting roughly 70 million people around the African continent, is still considered as a homogeneous institution. Whereas instead we claim that actually there are many sources of variation. In the example I'm going to talk about today, which is Nigeria, there is an important difference between the religious and legal environment on which the marriage actually takes place. We have the Muslim north, where actually there is Islam prevails, and so the Quranic law prescribes that husband can take up to 4 husbands. And then you have the Christian majority, which is more prevalent in the center-south, where actually only the first marriage is the one recognized by the national law. Now, we claim that this difference is not just formal. We claim that actually there could be a huge impact when it comes to shaping incentive for women in terms of bargaining power, fertility decision, and ultimately the possible children outcomes. So in this paper, we mainly focus on land inheritance rights, and which I consider to be among the most powerful elements affecting outside options for women. And we address this problem in 2 different ways. First of all, we provide a theoretical framework where the share of inheritance depends on the prevailing religious system, where the probability of actually receiving this inheritance depends on both a set of personal characteristics, like, for example, the number of male children, but also whether your marriage is actually recognized by the law or not. Depends also on the strength of the outside option, considering the disagreement payoff, which is also determined by a series of other factors, like, for example, education, social status, and parental wealth, and also bargaining power. We also provide some very preliminary evidence. We collected data from Nigeria, mainly the Enugu province, which is in the center-south, where polygamy is really widespread. And there are multiple layers of inheritance that coexist. If you would like to take 2 sort of findings away from this presentation, keep in mind that the labor supply of women in particular, we find that is affected by 2 different sort of channels. One is the inheritance channel, And the other one is the bargaining power. It's a bargaining waste channel, where actually the advantage associated normally to the first wife is prevalent. The results on the that we see from our data show that in the north of Nigeria, so the Muslim part, the inheritance channels tend to prevail, whereas in the center-south, whereas the Christian polygamy is the bargaining power channel to be the strongest. Now, just to give you an idea on how Nigeria is divided in terms of ethnic groups, if you consider Abuja, the capital, being sort of the center of the country, you can see that the north is mainly dominated by the Hausa Fulani group, which is actually Muslim, whereas instead the center-south is mainly country for the ethnic group of the Yoruba and Igbo people. Now, just keep in mind that the last census in Nigeria was conducted in 1963, so all these estimates are actually sort of very, kind of will give you a rough idea of this percentage of their size, but actually population has increased a lot ever since. In Nigeria, we identify three possible legal systems. One is the national statutory law, the other one is the Sharia law, mainly in the northern states, and then the customary law more in the center-south. All these three provide a substantial variation when it comes to the rights and obligations that affect the marriage. So, for example, the Quranic law prescribes that as I said before, each husband can take up to 4 wives. Whereas instead in the center-south, polygamy is sort of considered a continuation of this pre-colonial customary tradition, and so is not very much encouraged. When it comes to the work conducted by women, we can say that overall women are very much involved in the agricultural production, but slightly different is the possibility and right to say they have when it comes to the allocation of resources. They rarely inherit, and so whatever they can get in terms of rights is mainly the use rights, which happen via their children or their husband. Slightly different discussion has to be made for the north of Nigeria, where actually according to the Quranic law, every single wife up to 4 is entitled to receive a share of inheritance, although considerably smaller compared to the male counterparts. Now, the theoretical framework that we provide in this paper consider one polygamous household with 1 husband and 2 wives, a senior and a junior wife. Land is explicitly considered to have 2 different roles. One as a sort of a baseline stage value, if even no extra labor work is done onto it. And then the value A1, which basically represents the current productivity. Husband lives only for 1 period, and so his utility depends on consumption and on the disutility associated to effort. Whereas for the wife, we add to this extra, to this part, also the value of this expected inheritance, discounted by the value, discounted factor delta. So we have that omega represents the widow share prescribed by the religion R, whereas pi n represents the probability of inheritance. And as I said before, is an increasing function of the number of male children that she will have in due course. Now, we make a couple of assumptions when it comes to the probability of inheriting. First of all, we assume that because of the marriage recognition and the legal environment that we mentioned before, because every wife in the Muslim North actually is entitled to inheritance, we assume that pi in the Islam area is actually greater than the pi for the Christian overall. But we also assume, because of the legal environment, that since in the Christian area, only the first marriage is the one actually recognized, that the inheritance share that the senior wife is entitled to is actually greater than the one that the junior wife is entitled in the Christian area. The disagreement payoff is a function of 3 main elements. One is the baseline outside option, which represents the customary rights to residence or any other informal transfer that women can receive by a relative. Then we have this part of the expected inheritance. And then we have the function H, which represents a sort of a function of personal characteristics that we mentioned before, among which we can list education, beauty, or whether they have a job outside. The bargaining weights are a proportional function of the disagreement payoff, and the bargaining intra-household bargaining household power gap is represented by the ratio between a sort of three types of differential. Differential among the probability of inheriting, differential among the inheritance share, and differential among the personal characteristics. The results we have shows that the labor supply of women depends on the inheritance share, but also this personal characteristic S via two different types of channel. One is the inheritance return channel, in particular whether there's an increase in pie, for example, whether a wife can have a higher number of children or has an improvement in her personal characteristics. This will increase the marginal benefit of labor for all the others. But at the same time, we find that an increase in this personal characteristic is going to make her bargaining power stronger. And because by construction, this is going to reduce the bargaining power of the other junior wife, she will be able to extract a sort of a more favorable allocation with less effort. If we assume that there's basically an advantage in being the first wife, we find that an increase in the probability for the senior wife of inheriting reduce the junior wife bargaining power, and at the same time will increase the job, the labor supply that she will do. So basically, the senior wife exploits her position, her advantage, making the junior wife to work more. The senior wife can also have an increase in the labor supply due to an increase in their personal characteristics, but that will be depending on whether which one of these two channels actually prevails. We use for this study a sort of different sources. The first one is the one I just mentioned to you, collected in Nigeria in September 2025. By the University of Nigeria and Nsukka, University of Manchester, and University of Bath. We administered two different sort of questionnaire in this 8 location. One is the household questionnaire with a sort of information on decision-making, location, marriage decision. And the other one, which is actually administered to the Igwe or Eze head chief of village in this location, where we have a bit more of understanding of how these matters are seen at the community level. Because the data collection is still sort of very work in progress, we help the today I'm going to use a bit more data sources, complementary. So one is the Nigeria Demographic DHS survey, where we take information on bargaining power, but also the Nigeria General Household Panel survey, where we get information on plot level inheritance, wife status, and other personal characteristics. Just to show you where these locations visually are, as you can see, they are mainly in the center-south of the country, and the ethnic group that we find for the majority answering a questionnaire is the one of the Igbo. This is the picture taken from a polygamous household compound. In the back of the picture, you can see the main house of the husband, and whereas these other huts basically represent the kitchen, useku, where the meals are prepared, and where basically each wife with her biological children, this is the definition of kitchen actually, prepare the meals and actually have their own sort of life in a different way. If we were to mention the two main topics along which the survey has been aggregated, we can say that one will be on wife characteristics, which is the one shown today, but the one I will not show is the one on land characteristics. So here you can see that there is a sort of a first wife advantage, which is pretty clear in every decision-making question that we have asked. Senior wife tend to marry a lot younger compared to junior wife, but junior wife tend to be on average a bit more educated. In terms of estimating the intra-household bargaining power gap, we do this either with the DHS data, but also with the data from the pilot. And actually, the difference, there are no much difference, although the sample size is consistently smaller for our pilot. As you can see, again, being the first wife has a stronger positive effect in the decision-making index. And also quite interesting is that the number of children has a very strong positive effect, and this is independent of the wife rank. Sort of similar situation in the pilot data, but as I said, the power is a lot smaller in this case. Probably the only thing which is worth noticing here is the role of the parental tradition office. So whether one of your parents has held in the past as a senior position in the village, which basically shows how the social status and parental wealth have very important personal characteristics. We estimate also the determinants of the probability of inheritance. So we ask whether the probability of inheritance vary by status wife, and in particular by location when it comes to Sharia versus non-Sharia area. As you can see, the assumption that we made at the very beginning in terms of the probability in Islam being actually greater than the one found for the Christian is confirmed by our data. And in particular, you can see that the mean atom is strongly actually bigger for the Sharia versus the non-Sharia, showing how whenever the religious and legal environment prescribe this sort of inheritance part, this is actually going to play a significant role. The last slides on results is going to be the determinant on the labor supply, where we ask whether an increase, an improvement in the personal characteristics, but also the probability of inheritance, what kind of effect is going to have on the labor supply. Now, the first line for the variable inherits basically tests the importance of the wives other than the first. And as you can see, is actually the labor supply is going to inherit, is going to improve when the wife does not inherit, when the wife does inherit compared to when does not, showing that having certainty of inheritance rights is going to it's going to increase your labor supply. And this is definitely true for the Sharia Muslim area rather than the non-Sharia. If we instead want to measure the impact of the role of the first wife together with the inheritance probability, we will have to look at the sum of the coefficients for beta 2 and beta 3. And if you can see, actually, the effect is going to be positive and significant for the Sharia area, whereas instead it's going to be negative and significant for the non-Sharia, which basically shows these two channels that I mentioned to you before going on. So you can see how the inheritance return channel is going to prevail in the Sharia area, whereas instead in the non-Sharia is actually the bargaining weight channel to be the stronger. What does that imply? Basically imply that having being the first marriage for the first wife, the only one recognized by the national law, provide the first wife with this substantial advantage when it comes to decision. She can actually influence the labor supply of the more junior wife. She's basically going to exploit this position. One other last element to notice is that the number of sons, so one of the personal characteristics that we identify as crucial is going to have a very important impact on labor supply via the inheritance channel in non-Sharia area, as if basically personal characteristic can substitute whenever the legal environment does not assign you specifically with an inheritance share. In terms of what we're going to take this paper further, we would like to extend the data collection, both in area where polygamy is supported by Islam belief, but also at the same time where polygamy is not recognized, mainly to include other ethnic groups, like, for example, the Yoruba or Tiv ethnic groups. And the last thing that we would like to also continue working on is provide more precise and innovative measure for inheritance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alessia. We have time just for one or maybe at most two questions for clarification, if there are any. Yes, please.
Thank you very much for that good presentation. I just want to give certain clarification. I'm from Nigeria. The last census we had in Nigeria was actually 2006 and not 1963. And Enugu State is in southeast and not southwest, as shown in one of the slides. And when you look at Enugu State, it's typically a Christian state, and polygamous rate is very low. It's the lowest in southeast, less than 10%, and we didn't know the choice of Enugu State in your research work. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll just take those as clarifications, and we'll have to move on just in the interest of time. But thank you so much, Alessia. I mean, unless you wanted to respond at all.
It's fine.
Yeah, okay,
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Alessia. So we're going to move on now to India. And very pleased to welcome Prerna Kundu from the University of British Columbia in Canada. And her research is looking at the effects of the 2005 Hindu Succession Amendment Act on daughters' agricultural land ownership in India. Over to you, Prerna.
Great, thank you. So as mentioned, I'm going to present some work on inheritance reform in India, and this is joint work with Sankalp Sharma, who's a PhD student at USC. So as everyone in this room obviously knows, land is the primary asset in rural economies. It provides livelihood, social status, and political power. Yet fewer than 15% of landowners globally are women. In South Asia, and in many other developing countries as well, land primarily transfers through inheritance. And as a result, over 115 countries globally have reformed inheritance laws for gender equality. However, customs continue to override legal rights around the world. In India in 2005, the Hindu Succession Act amendment granted 80% of women equal co-parsonary rights. It applied to Hindu women, who are 80% of the population in the country. However, analysis from the agricultural census shows that 87.5% of agricultural plots continue to be owned individually by men. And it's ambiguous whether the inheritance reform in India has had any effects at all. Literature has shown that equal inheritance reforms increase daughters' education and bargaining power, but it's also shown that female child mortality rose in some parts of the country, as did, this should say male suicide. So there was an increase in male suicide. And there's some evidence on circumvention of the law itself. And research again has shown that inter vivos transfers or gifts to sons increase after equal inheritance reforms. There's an increase in dowry given to daughters. And there's also a phenomena of voluntary relinquishment that I'll talk a bit more about later, whereby sisters voluntarily give up their right in favor of their brothers. It's still an open question to some level about what actually happens to women's land ownership. And two of these papers that have looked at that find opposite effects, that in some cases, women's probability of inheriting land increases, while another paper, the Sanchari Roy paper from 2015, shows that there's no effect on the probability of inheriting land. So this is the question we answer in this paper. We ask whether the 2005 Hindu Succession Amendment Act increased daughters' ownership of agricultural land. This is the first direct evidence of whether the 2005 natural reform changed daughters' land ownership. We do this in the state of Haryana, which is a state with extreme patrilineality, so the lineage goes through the male line, the lowest sex ratio in the country, and strong institutional resistance to women's inheritance. We answer this question with a novel and new data set, where we have digitized plot-level land records from nearly 1,200 villages across 22 districts for over 20 years, which we have web scraped from government portals. And we use a differences in differences design, exploiting religious exemption, the fact that the law only applied to Hindus, Sikhs, and Jain women covered by the reform, and Muslim and Christian women continue to be governed by separate personal laws. So a quick review of findings that I'll talk about more later. We find that the reform increased daughters on land reforms. And when we say daughters, we actually mean sisters. So the number of sisters listed on plot land records increased by 0.18. And this seems like a large effect. It's a 142% over the control mean. And this is robust to plot fixed effects. So these are levels measured for plots seen before and after the reform. But these gains are modest, and ownership shares, or like meaningful control over the land, remains unchanged. The control mean is 0.13 sisters per plot. So in 100 plots, we see around 13 sisters listed as owners. And so the increase is from a very low baseline and well short of meaningful parity. The share of sisters as owners, which is the number of sisters divided by the number of brothers, rose only by 1.9 percentage points, and the effects go to zero if we include plot fixed effects. We also find suggestive evidence that the number of brothers who are listed as owners increases post-reform, suggesting potentially that families add co-owners without reallocating control, or, and we can't show this right now, but we want to test, households maybe compensate brothers by giving them different plots, and they add sisters to the ancestral plots. We find that social norms are not the main barrier to compliance. So we look at heterogeneity by the pre-2005 sex ratio in the village, and we don't find that effects go to zero with adverse sex ratios or the prevalence of this norm called hak tyag, which is voluntary relinquishment. And we find that effects are amplified and higher in villages with higher literacy and administrative capacity. So a quick roadmap, I'll talk about the setting and reform, the data, empirical strategy, the results, and I do want to spend some time talking about ongoing work before we conclude, just to talk about the other data sets that we can use and are bringing in to study what's really going on in the setting. Great, so the setting, where this study is set in Haryana, which is a large North Indian state that borders the national capital region of Delhi. It's primarily agrarian. 70% of workers are engaged in agriculture. It was also one of the states that was involved in the Green Revolution in the 70s and 80s. It's patrilineal and patrilocal, so land is inherited through the male line. Women marry out of their natal villages and move to the village of the husband. 87% of the population is Hindu, and 7% is Muslim, so we have sufficient religious diversity to conduct within-state comparisons. It has currently, but also historically, has had the lowest child sex ratio in India, only 893 girls per 1,000 boys, and it was among the first states to oppose the initial 1956 equal inheritance law. Legislators had attempted to bypass it for over 20 years. Great. So the Hindu Succession Amendment Act of 2005. Before 2005, daughters were excluded from co-parsonary under the Mitakshara Hindu system. So they were excluded from joint ownership of ancestral land. And states could also exempt agricultural land from the initial provisions of the 1956 inheritance reform. Some southern states granted co-parsonary equal rights to the daughters from 1976 to 1994. Nearly all of the papers that I showed you on slide 3 all study these historical amendments in southern Indian states, which historically have also been states where gender norms are more liberal and more favorable to women. The 2005 amendment was at the national level, and it said that daughters become co-parsoners by birth in the same manner as the son, which means that effectively when a daughter is born, she automatically has equal rights to her father's ancestral property in the same way as her brother. This law applied to Hindus, Sikhs, and Jains, who are roughly 80% of Indian women, and Muslim and Christians were exempt, which is how we're able to identify the causal impacts of this amendment. However, in practice in Haryana, Khap panchayats, which are caste-based, informal but influential groups, still continue to oppose women's claims to inheritance. And there's also the practice of hak tyag, or voluntary relinquishment, that remains widespread. And this is basically the idea that if my father has a land plot, I can walk into a court, sign a legal piece of paper, and voluntarily give up my right to the land in favor of my brother. Talking about the data, which I think is pretty exciting. So we use these land records, which are called Jama Bandis, that we have web scraped from Haryana government portals. We have 1.36 million plot year observations across 1,176 villages in 22 districts. These 1.3 million observations are coming from 7 million land records that we have web scraped. I'll show you an example on the next slide, but every land record has the full name of the owner and the name of the father, in most cases the grandfather name as well. It has information on plot characteristics, IDs for the plots, any mutation that happens to the land record gets recorded here. These are updated every 5 years, so registry years, and we have data spanning 2001 to 2023. What we do with the names is that we classify the gender and the religion of every owner using GPT-4o Mini, and we basically ask GPT to classify the names as male, female, neutral, these are mostly first names, or whether those are institutional owners. We also ask it to classify names, the religion of the owner, so whether it's Hindu, Sikh, Jain, Muslim, Christian, or other. We also validate this through manual review of subsamples. But it's not that hard for GPT to do this because names in North India follow some sort of logic. So names for women, for example, end with an E versus the others that end without that. We match siblings by fuzzy matching, so using the Jarrow-Winkler similarity rates on father and grandfather names. So for the same plot, if there are 3 owners and 2 of them share the name of the father, we call them siblings. And so a sister is an owner who is a female owner who has a sibling group of greater than size 1 at the plot level. And what's in progress? We have this data. We just haven't used it for this particular question. We also have information from these villages on land transactions. So we have the name of the buyer, the name of the seller, the price of a transaction and a transfer type, whether it's like a family transfer or not. And we also have cadastral maps. So we have the boundary of the plot, the size, and the land quality that we can link at the plot level and link back to these digitized land records. So this is an example of a sample Jamabandi record. It has 12 columns, and it has a lot of ID numbers that we use to identify plots. It has the owner names, and this is sort of how we measure sisters and brothers and so on. So you can see as an example here that Ravi Kishore and Inderjeet Singh both co-own this plot, and they were sons of Akhe Singh, who himself was the son of Bucha. And it tells us that this plot is divided equally. It has 2 divisions. And what's really interesting is that this particular plot had the voluntary relinquishment as well, and that shows up in the comments. So that tells us at some point there was a sister who had a right to this land, and she has given it up in favor of her brothers. So this is just an example of what we do. And so for the voluntary relinquishment results I'll talk about, we just do a word search for the word hak tyag, and then we're using these names for now to assign someone as a sister or a brother or a non-sibling woman or male owner. So that's what we do. For the outcomes for this particular paper, we're looking at the intensive margin, so the absolute number of sisters, an indicator variable for any sister listed as an owner on the plot, the sister share, and we think of this as a proxy for relative control in some sense, whether you're alone with 3 other brothers versus 50-50 and so on. And then we also look at the number of brothers to see if there's this like strategic co-owner expansion that's happening. The analysis sample, we want to do a diff and diff, so we need a balanced panel of plots that appear in both the pre- and post-2005 records. So in our preferred specification, we have 280,000 plot year observations, but we also show you robustness with plot fixed effects, and so for that, we have to use the full sample, mainly just for power reasons, and so our full unbalanced sample has 943,000 observations. And then for village characteristics and heterogeneity, we merge our data with the shrug, so data from the 2001 census, via fuzzy matching on village names to get the literacy rates, sex ratios, infrastructure indices, and administrative capacity before 2005. And the empirical strategy is a fairly standard definitive. The treatment is the Hindu, Sikh, and Jain plots. Control is Muslim, Christian. We classify based on pre-reform religious composition to avoid endogeneity. And in our preferred specification, we include religious group fixed effects. And this doesn't mean Hindu versus Muslim. We can actually do a very detailed classification on majority Hindus, co-owners, and so on. So that's why there's 17 categories. And for robustness, we show you regressions with plot fixed effects. Standard errors are clustered at the plot level. Great. So what do we find? We find that the number of sisters, as I'd mentioned, increases in these plots, even after you include plot fixed effects. So this is a 0.168 increase. So like I said, 128,000% increase over the control mean in the plot fixed years. There's an increase in the probability of the sister, but these effects disappear when you look at the plot fixed year fixed effect regressions, and the same is true for the sister share. So at least the fact that there is an increase on the number of sisters is a fairly robust finding, but these findings, the magnitude is fairly small and falls well short of any real parity or reallocation of land to women. And of course, to see that these are causal, we validate the parallel trends assumption. So these are just the event studies for all the main outcomes that I showed you before, just to say that the effects seem to sort of, for number of sisters, actually come in immediately after the law and kind of increase. Something weird's happening in this year, but they sort of like increase almost immediately after. And then for any sister, potentially the reason we find the null at the end is because effects kind of increase and then decrease eventually. And then nothing on the sister share and nothing on sister share looking at relative to brothers. And then for heterogeneity, we run a triple interaction with the post dummy and treatment and the variable itself, and we split up basically all of these categories by below median or above versus below median pre-2005. And what we find is that the strongest effects come from overall literacy rates. So if you were in a village where the overall literacy rate was higher, the effects are stronger. And it's not necessarily that it's female literacy rate, so it's not really about women's bargaining power being higher, but maybe just that in these villages there was more attention paid to the law itself. We create an indicator for admin capacity based on whether there was a post office, for example, in the village before. We find that that matters as well. We find a fairly significant and well-identified null effect of the sex ratio. So it seems like the gender norms don't really mediate the effects and bring them down to zero. We also look at the prevalence of voluntary relinquishment before 2005, so the Hak Tyag prevalence variable, and we don't find that effects are concentrated in villages that did not or did have this norm before 2005. So putting these results together, we are saying we find that the reform increased sisters on actual land titles, but this was from a very low base. There's no redistribution of control within plots, and the sister share attenuates to zero with plot fixed effects. And because I have a little bit of time, I think I can, okay, I can't click on this. Okay, never mind. Effects appear on both margins, but they are somewhat larger on the extensive margin. And we basically test whether effects in villages that already had sisters appearing on land records before, and we find that they're somewhat larger where there were no sisters pre-reform. And just a back-of-the-envelope calculation, we're sort of saying that an estimated 220,000 to 330,000 women were added to land titles in Haryana as a result of this law. But that's not a lot for a state with a really big population. And even these gains reflect low-cost compliance, so potentially just updating records in villages where literacy rates were high, rather than any meaningful reallocation of land. So in ongoing work, we want to understand these effects more. So if sisters are being added and brothers are also being added, what exactly is going on? So first, we can use our transactions data, merge the ownership records at the plot level to directly observe the strategic responses used by households to circumvent this law. For example, we can test whether families reallocate land before a daughter's claims become enforceable. So the law gets implemented in 2005, but do we see gift deeds and any sort of changes happening in 2003 and 2004? Second, we can test, like the Sanchari Roy paper, whether inter vivos transfers or gifts to sons increase post-reform. Basically, this transaction level evidence will tell us the mechanisms behind this performative compliance that we see. The other thing we can do is link to our spatial cadastral data. So like I said, we can link at the plot level with cadastral maps, and that gives us the size, the location, the irrigation source, and the land quality for these plots. So it would be interesting to understand whether the daughters who do actually get added to land records, do they systematically receive inferior, smaller plots in which are less agriculturally productive? Does land compliance vary by land value? So places where the land is more valuable, do we see a conflict between inheritance versus women wanting to claim their rights as well? And we can also test for spatial spillovers across neighboring plots and evaluate the Sutva assumption in the diff, which we can't with the data that we have currently. And so together, the goal will be to distinguish whether the reform changed the distribution of property rights only, which is what we have, or only the documentation of property rights. So to conclude, we show that inheritance reform achieved formal inclusion, but not substantive redistribution. Daughters do get added to titles, but ownership shares are unchanged within plots. Compliance is shaped by institutional capacity and not by social norm proxies. The policy implication from the results we find is that legal reform is necessary, but it's insufficient, and complementary investments in state capacity potentially may yield larger gains than norm change interventions as well. And like I said, the next step will be to use the transaction data and cadastral linkage to distinguish the changes in the distribution of property rights from the documentation of property rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prerna, and we will open it up for any questions of clarification at this stage. Yes, please.
Good afternoon. I have some small question. Do your findings suggest that legal recognition alone is insufficient without broader institutional social change to achieve substantive gender equality in land ownership?
Yes, and I think the setting matters because this is a state where the gender norms are fairly biased. And so in a context like that, simply having a national level policy by itself is not enough to change things on the ground, and some sort of like complementary social programs need to run to change social norms for meaningful changes. Thank you.
Oh, we have several here. Okay, let's just go round. Yes.
Hi. Oh. Hi, can you hear me? Yeah. Yeah, thanks for the nice presentation. You mentioned land inferiority, land quality. Do you have data on farm sizes, like average farm sizes, income? Because it seems like that's where the problem would come in for the daughters, where there's limited resources, kind of forcing them out as opposed to if there's other opportunities for them. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. So we can't do income because we don't have any other information of the households themselves, but we do have from our cadastral data the size of the plot, and because we know exactly where it's located, we can also use, for instance, satellite data to see land use, agricultural productivity. We would expect that since the state borders New Delhi, that plots in districts that are closer to Delhi would have very different dynamics to more agricultural plots in the inside districts, and so that's one of the directions in which we're going to take this with the plot data. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. I think we had two more. Yes, please.
How many of this is due to the newborn, and how many these new titles to women because of the family split or the inherit? Because the law, I'm not sure whether it's sequential or simultaneous. The first law in the other state, 1994, is actually to just give the inheritance, right? And then later, you now see, is also gives them the rights to have land even when they were born. So I'm not sure how much is because of, if it's later, and then have many other ways to substitute. They may not give land because they give many other things, okay? So I'm not sure how, if you can separate.
Yes, thank you. And that's one of the margins on which the other papers have looked at whether daughters' education increases, for example, because you could substitute your or dowries to daughters. In this case, the land was retrospective, so it applied at the same time to any woman who was born, and it applied in the future to any woman who was unborn, for example. It gave them this default right to their father's ancestral property. But in practice, the way these land records are updated is that family members have to inform the person who's updating the records for the changes to actually show up, which is why it sort of comes down to seeing effects in places where the daughters or the parents themselves actually want to change the land records and give the effect. But the law itself applies uniformly across the board to new daughters, but also all the existing daughters. It even applies to married women, for example.
I think we had one more. Yes, please.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I'm wondering whether you've also tested across certain time periods when we had government policies which incentivized female acceptance, female inclusion in the land records, because some work that we did in UP, where norms are equally stringent, showed that when people wanted to get money from the state for under a particular scheme, that is when they got the daughters included into the land record.
Thank you. That's a great suggestion. We haven't looked at policies that require women to be on that, and we can check how that works for Haryana. There are also some other policies that governments have to encourage women. So, for example, the tax on the properties is lower if it's registered in the name of the woman, and that's one of the things we'll also sort of get to later, which is sort of how does inheritance reform interact with other policies that the state is doing and what the combined effects are. Thank you.
Very good. Thanks again, Prerna. We'll give you another round of applause. We're going to move on to our final presentation now, and then there will be time for broader discussion on all four of these presentations. But first, I'm very happy to introduce Sabrine Beg from the University of Delaware, who will present on behalf of a team looking at the effects of land records reform in Punjab, Pakistan, on women's land rights, looking at the intended and unintended consequences of the reform. Sabrine, over to you.
Okay, thank you so much. I am the last presenter that comes before lunch, so I'll try to make this interesting and get you all ready for lunchtime. This is joint work with my colleagues here at the bank, so Kate and Jeremy at the bank, Erica Field at Duke University, Susanna at Science Po, and Arsalan, who is a PhD student at University of Delaware. So just to, in terms of a broad motivation, policies, as we've seen many been presented today, that increase female income or household bargaining power have the potential to improve women's well-being, as well as have persistent effects even on future generations. However, these policies that try to reallocate resources within the household can be neutralized by countervailing forces and mediated by social norms and that prevail in the context that they operate in. In particular, inheritance policy is an instrument that has been used by many governments to reallocate wealth towards females. And I think I saw in one of the earlier presentations that many countries, over 100 countries, use this to try to allocate more wealth towards females. That wealth can be good for them, but the policies that try to transfer this wealth may lead parents to reallocate in other ways. So again, there can be countervailing reallocations, and eventually they might not end up to be as good for women as we intend them to be. More importantly, I'm going to try to bring the focus to marriage markets. So inheritance is closely tied to marriage markets, and these decisions are sort of made simultaneously in the household. And so it's important and crucial to look at these markets operating simultaneously and look at marriage market effects when we think about inheritance reform or any kind of reallocation of investments within the household. And so in particular, right, I'll be talking also about dowry and marriage outcomes, because there are models that we know of that think of transfers to women as being either at marriage or at the time of the death of the father. And so there is going to be the substitutability between investments. And I will think about substitutability between inheritance as well as dowry or other human capital investments in the women. And so we also want to think about the theory of dowry and how that is good or bad for women. And, you know, dowry has been shown to be in the theory as a market clearing price, so as something that makes marriages happen, but also can possibly be good for women in that it higher dowry can mean can signal a higher reservation utility of the women and allows for bargaining in the marriage market. So what we're going to do is study a land record reform in Punjab, Pakistan, that I will argue strengthened women's property rights to inherited land. This is not a legal change, but this is a reform that changed the process of inheritance and made it costly to exclude women in the inheritance process. Legally, the law requires land to be transferred to women. So women have a share of their father's land. De facto, though, disinheritance is very common. And so in our sample, as I said, the law requires land to be transferred to women. In our sample, only 22% of women report that they inherit property from their fathers. The inheritance process involves two sort of stages: a verification of anyone that has a legal entitlement to the estate, and this includes the wives, but importantly includes the sons and the daughters, and then sort of dividing according to the legal share, and I'll show you that the shares differ and are prescribed and fixed. So the legal provision is to go according to the legal shares where women have a share to their father's estate. So what happens in the reform is that provincial government, in partnership with the World Bank, modernize the land records and digitize them, both the land records as well as the inheritance process. So we go from a very manual inheritance process to a fully digitized inheritance process. So pre-reform, land records are maintained manually. And all transactions happen manually as well. And so I have here a picture of the local officer that used to monitor land records. And so when the father passed away, he would just open up the book, look for the plot, and cross out the name of the father and write down the names of the sons or whoever was there. So verification was also manual, and so there were many loopholes that allowed families to exclude women. So the statistic that I showed you, which is about 20%, is not surprising. Many times only the brothers showed up for the mutation and the brothers' names were on the title. Now we move to, with the post-reform, there are service centers that are set up for each sub-district. Everything happens in these sub-district centers and everything is digitized. And so the verification of heirs process happens through biometric verification, which are tied to the national ID card system. So as long as you're registered as a citizen, and that rate is pretty high, so the penetration of ID cards is pretty high, it's close to 98%, you will need to be present at the time of the verification and do biometrics. And so I will show you, right, that this bureaucratic change made it quite costly to exclude women. And so both in practice, but also we can expect that the change to the maintenance of land records and land transactions could have led to effects on the property rights of women and their ability to exert those rights. So we're going to use the rollout of the program for identification. So program rolled out over time across sub-districts of the whole province. And we will use this timing for verification, for identification. And we will use the timing of inheritance transaction in a family. So we don't have to pay attention to everything on this slide, maybe the specification. And so for the first set of results, I will show you effects based on the timing of the reform in your district, as well as the timing of the death of the father. And so the treated women are going to be the ones whose fathers passed away after the reform in their sub-district. And so I can include sub-district fixed effect and timing of death fixed effects too. So we are going to want to see what happens to your probability of getting land if your father passed away after the reform, compared to the women or families where or inheritance has happened under the old system. I will also show you, right, effects for women whose fathers are still alive, right? So if the reform changes what people anticipate about how they're going to have to allocate their land, it can change how those families make decisions. And so because we want to focus on the marriage market effects, we're going to see effects on cohorts that get married or whose marriage market outcome gets realized after the reform or under the new environment relative to before. So I'll look at women that are young at the time of the reform, and I'll see what happens to their eventual marriage market outcome, even if no inheritance has happened in the family. And so this is for the women who expect to exert more property rights later when their father passes away, how do their outcomes change? We'll also exploit variation in the sibling composition because that gives us interesting leverage because some women are going to stand to inherit a lot more than others. So without going into details on the religious shares, the shares are such that sisters get half of what the brothers get. And so if there are more brothers, the eventual change in share of women is smaller compared to if there are less brothers. So I think I have an example here. If there's one brother and one sister, then the sister shares 1/2. If there are 3 sisters, if she has 2 other sisters, then her share is 1/5 of the total estate. So there is variation in the intensity of treatment based on the sibling composition. And that's also what we'll use for identification. We used 2 sets of data that we worked really hard to get because no existing data sets kind of measure inheritance and neither dowries. So we use a survey that was done by the government, and we included questions in the survey related to inheritance. That's the first part. And then we collect our own data. So we conduct a large household survey across the whole province that measures families' landowning status. It measures sibling composition, dowries, marriage outcomes, and inheritance outcomes if the fathers have passed away. All right, very quickly in the results, I'll first show you what happens to inheritance. So we see a large effect on inheritance reported by women if the timing of the father's death is around the reform. So compared to the women whose fathers died shortly before the reform in their sub-district, the likelihood that they inherit increases by about 10 percentage points, and off of a base of 20-30%, this is a large increase. And this is not just whether you were on the paper or whether you got it and later gave it away. This was if outcome here is inherited and then kept by the time we're surveying you, right? So they may have relinquished the land later, but there is an effective increase in ownership of land for the women whose fathers pass away. For these women, I don't know how much time I have 5 minutes, so I won't go to every single table, but I'll try to summarize the results for you because we have many results. For these women who inherit more land, we see negative outcomes in terms of their marriage market. So when we focus on the women who were not yet married, we find that their marriage risk increases. So they get the land when their father passes away, but they marry early. And kind of because of that, likely, they have lower quality husbands and they end up with lower education. So there's an increase in marriage risk for women that inherit land. And now go to the anticipated inheritance effects. So for the women that expect to inherit more in the future, so for the women whose fathers are still alive, we find the opposite effects, actually. And so better outcomes for women whose fathers are still alive. We see that their marriage risk goes down. In line with that, they end up with more education and slightly better husbands, at least not worse husbands. So the match quality is worse in marriages earlier for the women that inherit, and it's better match quality in later marriage and better education for the women that who haven't inherited yet. What are the mechanisms that can explain the realized effects that are on the negative side? So if we think of, or for both sets of effects, I want us to think of, without putting a conceptual framework in front of you, the substitutability between land versus other investments. And other investments include dowry, education, and delaying marriage. All of these are good for women, and all of these can be thought of as, levers that parents or families have in how they transfer or how they invest in the daughters. We see slightly lower dowries, and so the women that do get the land possibly suffer because there is these other investments go down. And so this land that they're getting, it could be acting as basically a marriage clearing price. And so you have the land in hand. It's easy for the families to get this daughter married, and we see an increase in their marriage risk. It doesn't seem like the land is increasing their bargaining power, so it's not playing that role. It's playing it's playing the role of clearing the marriage market, and not necessarily increasing the bargaining power. And there could be many reasons, right? The groom households could view this land as having contested rights. The father is not around to negotiate for the daughter. The land is often not in the village of the groom's family and outside the village. So if we think of land versus dowry, maybe dowry is better for women in terms of negotiating a better match in the marriage market. The anticipated inheritance effects, right? This expected land, right, does seem to raise a woman's reservation match quality and possibly the bargaining power in the marriage market. So for the women who stand to exert better property rights on their father's property in the future, the parents hold out, right? They delay marriage, and because of that, there's more investment in education. And so that tells us that maybe another mechanism I have here, right, could be that there may be complementarity between education and land ownership, and that's why we see the increase in education. Another difference between these two groups is that for the ones whose fathers are alive, the fathers are negotiating for them in the marriage market compared to brothers or uncles, and there may be differential altruism that can lead to better outcomes for these girls. And so to sort of summarize and leave you a little less confused, generally you see that the land reform, which was not a legal change, but a process change, leads to an increase in women's likelihood of inheriting land. With the actual transfer of land and the expected transfer of land seem to operate differently in how they impact women's well-being or the welfare of women and the marriage payments and marriage outcomes that they have. With the actual transfers of land, families seem to substitute towards earlier marriage rather than waiting for higher quality grooms. With expected inheritance, it raises a women's bargaining power in reservation utility from marriage and allows them to have better human capital outcomes. And so generally, where we want to go with what we want to think more about is that rights on inherited property can have differential effects, and this can be mediated by the timing of the transfer, what the signal about the true property right of the female is relative to her brothers, and who negotiates on behalf of the women in the marriage market in order to determine more clearly what the eventual welfare outcomes for females are. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Sabrin. So let's open it up just for questions for clarification to Sabrin first, and then we'll open it up more broadly. Yes, please.
Clarification question. So I think for the first generation, actually, I think just for class here, so I think here there are similar paper on India's inheritance law. It's also for the second generation, empower the female to get higher education. That's what you find too. But my question is for the first generation, the woman, you also see the education is going down. So these are when father passed away, so they were very little and then they already, so I think the age effect. So I'm thinking whether they just get married and then how can they still have education? So I just want to clarify. So you have a different age in that group, right?
We have all ages in the group, but it is true that they are special in the sense that their fathers passed away when they were young. So it's a special group in that sense, right? They were unmarried when their fathers passed away. So for those women, they get married earlier than the other women that were already married, right? And kind of as a spillover, I think we see the lower education, right? Because the marriage risk is very highly correlated with dropout from school.
You probably need to use the mic.
If you look at age specific, maybe you get a bigger effect. So that's what I try to get clarification on.
The size of the effect?
No. Oh, just press. Okay. Yeah. No, I think just clarification, really. So I think if you just look at average, or you look at a different age of the child when father passed away, so you may get a bigger effect for the children rather than the average effect.
Yes, absolutely. We can look at the cohorts within our treatment group.
Yes.
Any other questions for clarification?
So you went back and did the survey after the reform, is that right?
Yes.
So do you see any difference between the places that where it was implemented earlier? In the sub-districts, was the communication different? Were there different impacts based on that timing?
Just in terms of the survey?
When you showed the map, it looked like it was rolled out over a period of years, right? Was there any difference based on the early treated versus the later treated?
Yeah, we're using some of that for identification, right? So we're looking at the younger cohorts relative to the timing of reform in your area. And so that allows us to account for any aggregate changes over generations or over cohorts. But we do, everything happens in now, closer to now relative to the timing of the reform, and everything is retrospective. And so the timing of the rollout, we're using it for identification. We haven't really looked at how far ago the reform was, whether that just affects our data collection and how people respond, not for outcomes, but generally.
Okay.
But that's part of the empirical strategy, like the different places getting it at different points in time.
Any other questions for clarification to Sabrin? Yes, please.
Thanks for the paper. So is there in this context a strategic postponement of doing the inheritance from the death? I don't know, in different parts, in some parts it could be like 10 years with the title still to the dead father and people are not doing nothing, and I wonder whether that can play a role or not.
Yes, that happens, and we haven't looked at that as an outcome, but you're right, the actual registration of death and inheritance, the mutation of the land sometimes happens right at the time of the death, or people can wait. And so you're right, in many cases people wait when it's necessary, right? When they have to register for a government program and they need the updated titles. And so we in some other work, we see that many titles are just in the name of a dead person. So we just see less. That's just harder to do in the new. That's just a treatment effect always, but we haven't really looked at as an outcome in our data, but we do have it. So that's interesting.
I guess, but my concern, or actually an interesting outcome, would be just to see if the prospect of the reform affects that, because maybe you want to hurry to do it pre-reform if you want to have your older brothers, and so that could be an interesting outcome in itself.
Yes. Just by it's sort of an aside, but in our sample, most people have registered their, the nature of our sample was such that they were, it was a phone survey, so it was on a phone listing. And in this phone listing, most people are more likely to have registered the deaths and updated their titles. So we might not have very much variation there. But if we had a more representative, if we didn't have this restriction in our sample, then we might see more of that difference and be able to see the treatment effect on that. But it's important to think about the effects because it affects the composition of for the women that we're looking at, right?
Okay, thank you so much, Sabrine. So I think at this point, we have about 20 minutes left. Let's open it up for any broader reflections, comments, questions, looking across this set of 4 papers. Extremely interesting. I see Victoria and one over here, so let's take those 2 first.
Yes, so thank you very much to all of the presenters, very interesting. My name is Victoria Stanley. I'm a land person at the bank. So I want to ask our 4 researchers, if you were in a room with a government official or a bank staff member and you were making policy recommendations based on your research, what would you be telling us we should or should not be doing in terms of our land programs, whether we're digitizing or we're doing systematic first registration based on your research? Thank you.
Excellent question, Victoria. I was going to ask exactly the same one, but I'm glad that you did. I don't have to abuse my role as chair. So I'm actually going to, let's take that because that's basically 4 questions because we have 4 presenters. So I'm going to take each in turn of presenting. So Laura, you have the pleasure of going first. Then we'll go to Alessia, Prerna, and then Sabrine.
Okay. Yeah, I think it's a super crucial question. I think that one of the implications of the paper that I'm working on is first and foremost that gender neutral doesn't mean, like, a gender neutral implementation isn't gender neutral in practice in terms of the implications, because when this is getting imposed on a customary system that is perhaps like the implementation can become biased even if it is statutorily neutral, or even perhaps trying to help women, that's definitely not the case. And then I think also just really an attention to the fact that land rights is happening in a broader social environment, and that individuals and families are making their choices not just about land in isolation and not just about land even with agricultural production, but land is social, and that the social dynamics of families, both intra-household and between households, are going to be shaped by the land rights.
Excellent. Alessia?
So one of the elements that we noticed from our survey is that basically in the area where we went, there's no market for land, and 90% of the people that were surveyed inherited their land. So having clarity in what are the inheritance rights is crucial, because this is, especially for women, is going to affect not only at the time of the inheritance, but what we were trying to show with the theoretical model, that this is going to affect today's bargaining power. And today's bargaining power is crucial, especially when it comes to children outcomes, because they can influence the children. So having clarity on these assets when it comes to rights is super important, especially for women.
Excellent, thank you. Prerna?
Yeah, I think from our research, what follows is that purely legal change doesn't actually translate into anything on the ground. The law in India changed 20 years ago, but to this date, I mean, I can say from personal experience, I'm from the state of Haryana, women are not seen as rightful heirs to the property itself, even though it was 20 years ago that the law changed. So I think the main conclusion is just that sometimes you have to have norm change interventions on the side, maybe investments even in administrative capacity. I think Sabrine's work is really interesting because the stage at which we get our data is that land record is still maintained by the local person Patwari, and all they've done is they've put them online. But what you need is you need somebody to come physically to verify it and to change it, and that's actually the stage at which it seems like things do change. And so I think it's no longer a conversation that happens a lot in India because it's seen as a legal change that was solved 20 years ago, but it needs to continue, and it needs to continue with more proactive policy changes.
Excellent. Thank you, Prerna. And last but not least, Sabrine.
Let me see. I teach this to my students, but this is also what I would tell policymakers, is to listen to economists and refrain from telling people what they should be doing, right? And so I think understanding, like in order to bring behavior change, understanding where behavior comes from is primary. And that's why you can put a law in place and not see effects if it doesn't change the incentives. So two things, I think, understanding the context where we are trying to bring behavior change and being sensitive to that, and complementary interventions that allow that those good intentions to translate into change. Because if there is one intervention, but there are other countervailing things, understanding what are the complementary interventions, whether it's something targeting norms or something targeting how people understand things, information, sometimes can have a big bite in bringing bringing actually behavior change and making policies effective.
Excellent. Thank you, Sabrine. And thank you, Victoria, for posing that question. Let's go over here.
All right. My question is more of a question for Sabrine's paper. It's neither clarification nor big picture, but maybe there's some external validity here. Are land and husbands complements? I think that might help explain your results, that if women who get the land now, they might need to acquire a husband in order to unlock its returns, but if in the long run, women have time to invest in human capital, then they can hold out and do better on the marriage market. Does that make sense to you?
Yes. The marriage market outcome of a female, right, it matters a lot for her whole life and the children's life. So any form of I think of it also as human capital investment, anything that affects the marriage market outcome of a children. So if you want to call it like complementary, or did you call it complements? Or if land and husbands are two things that both can mean something for the well-being of women. So in this paper, right, like being able to exert property rights on the land means that you can bargain for a better marriage outcome, right? Or if you can bargain for a better marriage outcome with the prospect of more wealth from your parents, it's a win-win.
Right. I guess my intuition was for the adverse results on women who get the land early is that they get this asset, but they need to settle for a lower quality marriage to actually unlock the returns immediately rather than being able to wait.
Yes. So any marriage in land in that case is like the substitute, right? And so if you need some resources for the marriage to happen. So I'm interpreting that as access to that land because your father passes away makes it cheap for you to get married right away.
Yes, next question, please.
What would be your description for high quality grooms here?
We measure, and that's subjective. I didn't show you the table, but we have a few things that we are using to measure marriage match quality. So there is consent, like how much consent the female had. We have age difference And so we're taking at smaller age difference to be better. And then we have husband, education, and income. We also have land ownership, right? So if land is good, then the people that have land are better for the females.
Okay, Klaus.
Daniel first, I think. Please.
No, my first question is to Alicia. I think the results show a decrease in labor supply, despite the difference in magnitude across all religious groups. But what do you mean by labor supply? Is it labor supply like domestic chores, or is it outside work? And I think my question to Prina is, who is listed on the land record? Are they current owners, or does it include also sons and daughters who are going to inherit the land in the future? And then the follow-up thing is, do you have information, if it just includes, let's say, the sons and daughters who are going to inherit, but do you have information on actual transfers? Because your estimate might be a lower bound, but if you have actual transfers happening, or if you have enough data before and after, I think that may be something to look at it. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much. Probably I wasn't very clear about when I got to the slide. So what we measure is actually the labor supply differential. So what you notice is the differential between the first wife with respect to the second wife. And so being negative means that the second wife is actually working more than the first wife. And we associate this to the bargaining inheritance channel, but to the bargaining weights channel, meaning that basically the first wife exploit her advantage and reduce her labor supply at the expenses of the most junior wife.
Is it domestic chores or
on land?
On land.
Sorry, on land.
Yeah.
Prerna, over to you.
Yeah, so the land records list current owners, but you're absolutely right that there are possibly these transfers happening for people who are not listed on the records themselves. So what we've collected now also, but not included today, is data on land transactions. And these list for every transaction and every village in the state, the name of the party, the name of the buyer, the name of the seller, the transaction amount. And when there are family transfers, the transaction amount says 0. So what we can measure is whether these family transfers are actually happening or not. And we can do this before and after 2005. We've not done it yet, but that's the direction we're going in, using the transactions data to understand exactly how the transfers are working.
Klaus, did you still want to come in?
Yes, of course. No, sorry, my apologies for, I may have missed it, but for Sabrin, I think the question is, are you controlling for the date of the death of the farmer? Because that, of course, will also affect your education outcome. I think I may have missed that, but I think that was a clarification question.
Yes, and you're right. And we are able to, that's important, and as well as the age of the girls. So we're able to, because we have both variation in timing of death and variation in the rollout of the reform, we can separately account for those time trends.
Okay, the floor is still open. Please.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think for most of the presenters, as I've said, there are other variables that were never used. I think you mentioned about the size and also the zoning. Where I come from, you cannot subdivide the plot to a certain minimum size, irrespective of whether people are inheriting or not. So I don't know to what extent can this variable be looked into on the size. Now, also on the zoning, even if the land has been inherited, but you also have to be mindful what the law is saying on the zoning aspect as well. There have been cases where land was being used for, let's say, tea production, and then the kids are inheriting, they decide to change it to macadamia nuts because it's more marketable. So I don't know whether those zoning aspects were also looked into. Thank you.
I don't know who would like to take that one if you feel it's relevant to your case. Maybe Prerna?
Yes, so subdivisions do matter, and when a plot is subdivided, the plot ID, for example, if it was 72, would become 72 by 1 and 72 by 2. So we can measure subdivisions at the plot level. Zoning matters less because plots can kind of be indefinitely subdivided. There's no minimum size as such, and there's literature showing that one reason for misallocation in agriculture in India is precisely small sizes of plots. But we can look at the subdivisions themselves as a heterogeneity, whether effects are different in very subdivided plots versus consolidated united plots. And we haven't done that, but we can in the future with the plot data.
Thank you. Did any of the other presenters want to address this question? No? Okay. Any other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you all. That was an excellent set of papers. I had some specific questions. So one was for Alicia. So the question is, does having children and their number, or maybe sons in particular, increase the bargaining power of a wife? And how does that vary between Christian and the Islamic cases? And then I had two questions for Prerna. So the first is about the inheritance law. So why did it exclude Muslims and Christians? Was this endogenous to traditional inheritance norms? So that's the first. And then the second is, why did you conduct the analysis at the plot level instead of the farm level or the household level? Because there could be allocations within the family across plots.
Thank you very much for this question. So yes, we include the number of children among the most important, one of the most important personal characteristics, together with education for wives. And yes, it does increase the bargaining power. And we notice that this seems to be actually stronger in the non-Sharia versus the Sharia area. Basically, because in the Sharia area you have a little bit more entitlement for women when it comes to inheritance share. There's already the legal environment already protects you, assign you rights in this sense. Whereas whenever you don't have that, say for example in the non-Sharia area, especially for wives other than the first, the personal characteristic seems to play a much stronger role.
Prerna?
Yeah, so on the response to the first question on why the law did not affect Muslims and Christians, so there's no uniform civil code in India, and each religious group is governed by different rules. And the Hindus were influenced by this law called the Hindu Succession Act, and there's been a discussion on reforming it for the last 50 years, since the last time it was reformed in 1956. And so the law change we're using is simply the amendment to the Hindu Succession Act itself, which is why it did not apply to Muslim and Christians. And somehow I don't have a good answer to this. There hasn't been that much of a discussion about changing customary laws in general for other religions. It was mainly that. On the second one, we do this at the plot level, not at the household level, because it's harder to identify households and who is farming together, because we don't have data on inputs or agriculture or exactly how the land is being used. So within the plot, we can credibly identify sisters. But if we try to do this at the household level, it's a bit harder to define the unit. But one of the things we can do and haven't done that well yet is we could potentially try to identify cousins by using the grandfather name, for example, and create like a bigger data set that's at this like broader family level. Though even then we would have to make some assumptions on whether they farm together or not. So that was the main reason for doing it at the plot level.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for those really great questions. And just, if you'll allow me just a couple of moments to maybe share some closing reflections. First, I really want to thank all the presenters. This was really a very, very rich set of contributions to the literature. Very, very thought-provoking. And thanks also to our audience for really great engagement. I think if we look at these papers together, clearly it sort of highlights the complexity of inheritance and intergenerational wealth transmission, especially when you sort of look at it through the lens of gender equality. And I think, Laurie, you nailed it. Land rights happen in a broader social context and setting. And we've seen that across all of these country settings, legal and administrative reforms can lead to some important effects. They can be positive, but almost always they operate not in isolation. They operate in combination with other factors. They're shaped by, household structures, social norms, bargaining power came through strongly across all the presentations, forms of implementation, and then the incentives that sort of shape how families respond to these sort of external stimuli. And I think, and I'm very glad that Victoria posed the questions about, we always do, of course, in the World Bank, we say, what's the policy implication, the so what question. And I think the discussion brought this out really very nicely. I think there's an important agenda around policy, around measurement. And if we want reforms to translate into real economic opportunities, particularly for women, it's important to understand not just whether women are actually formally recognized as owners, but whether they actually have control in practice over assets, how decisions are made within households, and whether the legal rights are actually enforceable in practice. And this is completely consistent with the approach that we take in our World Bank Group gender strategy on gender and assets, and how you might measure that and how you might reflect it in policy design. The other thing that I think came across really strongly in all of these presentations and the discussion is that it's incredibly important to distinguish between the intended and the unintended consequences. Yes, strengthening women's land rights and inheritance rights is very important. It's an important avenue. But it's all of the accompanying reforms, all the other things that you need to pay attention to realize better outcomes in practice. The points come across around administrative and state capacity. Careful implementation matters a lot. And understanding, the role that local norms and household dynamics play in shaping the practical outcomes. So with that, we'll close, but huge thanks again to all our presenters and to everyone who joined the session, and to Klaus and all the organizers of the conference.
And of course to the chair.